So welcome everybody to the joint webinar. We would wait 1 more minute and then we will start with the event. So welcome to the joint international webinar, Sustaining Cities Naturally, Urban Ecosystem Restoration. I see that still people are coming in, but we have a tight schedule. So I'm asked to start now. This webinar is a side event of the European Week of Regions and Cities and brings together cities, regions, local authorities, city network representatives, researchers, civil society, and experts on nature-based solutions and urban ecosystem restoration from Europe, China, Latin America, but also other regions. I'm Sandra Naumann. I'm a senior fellow at the Ecologic Institute in Berlin and the coordinator of the INTERLACE projects, one of the organizing projects. Before we start, just some admin information for you. I would like to mention that this webinar will be recorded. We have a Q&A function for your comments and questions. And today we also have translation in Spanish and Portuguese, and tomorrow in Chinese. And the Zoom link that you have received, it's working for both days. So also if you will join tomorrow, it's the same link. Okay, so why this webinar? So I think we all know that ecosystem restoration is essential if we are to continue to live on this planet. And this applies to all landscapes, including cities. And actually policymakers must pick up the pace to make the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, as well as other numerous initiatives and efforts to restore ecosystem a success, which is really urgent. And on the other hand, there is already a large body of research that can support practitioners and policymakers in doing so, as well as many projects that have successfully implemented nature-based solutions on the ground. So this webinar aims to illustrate how research projects can contribute to achieving restoration targets. So, and I said joint event, so why is it a joint event? So the European Commission has funded 4 research projects under the Horizon 2020 program, of which all aim to support international cooperation and knowledge creation and exchange between local authorities and researchers to promote the restoration of urban ecosystems in Europe, China, and Latin America. So there is a lot of knowledge and experience to share, not only within our project teams and between the researchers and the cities in the teams, but also between these 4 funded projects and a larger audience. So that's why we decided to join forces, pool our stories and insights, and invite experts from the projects and beyond to speak and discuss with you, the audience, what is needed to create healthy and livable cities. And I'm very happy to briefly introduce to the coordinators of this project. And I would like to ask Rosa to put a spotlight on Marianne, Rick, and Tom so that you can see them. Yes, I hope that's working. I can only see Marianne, but I hope Tom and Rick are also coming, or it's just my screen. Perfect. So spotlight is on. We're on the virtual stage, so we can't be you in person, but I would like to introduce you to Marianne Sanderson from the Aarhus University in Denmark. And Marianne is coordinating the REGREEN project. And we have here also Rick de Vreese from the European Forest Institute in Germany, who coordinates the Clearing House project. And we have Tom White here from the University of Sheffield, who coordinates the CONEXUS project. And INTERLACE, the INTERLACE project is complementing this group. And well, sorry, you can only see here the coordinators, but you cannot see the amazing teams that form and drive these projects. But I have good news, because you will see some of the team members in this webinar. So please stay tuned. So thank you. I have to remove you from the spotlight for a second, but you will show up later, so no worries. So in line with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, the proposed EU Nature Restoration Law, and the previous network semester on nature-based solution standards and quality, we have 6 wonderful sessions, and we can see what's on today's program. There is a slide Rosa already shared. Maybe we can see it again for day 1. What's the agenda? We have the pleasure to have Ben Caspar here from the European Commission, who will give a keynote speech. And today we have 3 sessions. The first is focusing on the economics of nature-based solutions, the second one on policy governance and institutional issues, and the third one on social aspects of nature-based solutions. And tomorrow we will hear more about the ecological quality, education, and environmental aspects. Thanks. And I will stop here because we're for time issues. And with great pleasure, I would like to welcome our first guest and keynote speaker, Ben Caspar from the European Commission, working at DG Environment. And Ben is managing urban biodiversity policy in the Commission. He studied biology. He joined the Commission 20 years ago and has since worked on marine conservation, adaptation to climate change, sustainable food policy, and I think much more. And for the past years, he has been worked more on urban environment policy, and he's now part of the team implementing the biodiversity strategy for 2030, and including the nature restoration law. And with those words, Ben, the floor is yours. You have like 10 minutes.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yes.
Thanks. Well, hi, everybody. I hope I mean, I think some of you, I'm not in a room where I can ask for a show of hands, but some of you might have already heard me speak because we've had a session earlier today on urban greening plans and a couple of sessions yesterday on the nature restoration law. But I'm going to try and say things a little bit differently, but if not, then I apologize. But, you know, you can't hear these messages too many times. I sent a presentation. I don't know if you received it because I only sent it just a moment ago. But
yes,
if not,
I do have it. I can share it now.
Yeah, let's do the presentation. Why not? Because then that's nice and professional. So today I'm really going to talk about, I mean, the title is Europe's ambition to create green and resilient cities. I think Europe's ambition is to create a green and resilient society as a whole, for the whole of Europe. But I think for the first time really in this policy cycle of the last few years, the importance of urban ecosystems has really been recognized. And so I'm going to then, having talked a little bit about the bigger picture, the wider context, I'm going to talk a little bit then about what we're specifically doing now for cities and in the urban context. And I'm trying to think about what's relevant, you know, what we can share, what's relevant for our international audience as well. So if you can just go to the next slide. I think this is the big context for us. The big policy framework for the European Commission is the European Green Deal. And for me, it's absolutely great because it's got the word green right there as our main policy framework. So it's bringing together all these different aspects of environmental policy into one, but also linking them to all the other policies. This is the flagship policy of the European Commission at the moment, and it brings protecting and restoring nature to the front. And that has not always been the case. And so I'm super excited about that. I think the fact that it's there and people are now talking about nature and biodiversity so seriously, up with climate change and all the other aspects of our policy, is because everyone's got a growing awareness of the fragility of the planet, the importance of nature and biodiversity. And I think people are beginning to realize more and more, I mean, people have known for many decades, but more and more just how important it is that we have to take action now and that it's really, really urgent. So if you could just go to the next slide. Part of this background is obviously that there's a global and EU biodiversity crisis. I mentioned in one of my presentations earlier today that I woke up this morning to see this report that we've lost 70% of our biodiversity, our animals biodiversity since 1970, so around when I was born, and I just find it absolutely shocking. I mean, if you think of the scale of the biodiversity loss, the habitat loss, it really means that some of our targets which we set in previous strategies have not been working, and we really have to do something urgently about it. So if you can go to the next slide. We've come forward with a biodiversity strategy for 2030. And it's got 4 main pillars. I worked with a team sort of supporting them on the development of this biodiversity strategy, but it's really the whole of the Environment Department and many other people who contributed to this over the years. There was a biodiversity strategy for 2020 which had targets, and we analysed the targets, and a bit like the previous global biodiversity targets, most of them, a majority of them, have not been met. So you look at the strategy and you go, well, what went wrong? Well, we made a strategy and it didn't work. How do we change that strategy? So we came up with 4 main pillars: protecting nature, and we've increased the size of our protected areas. We're going to increase them from 18% on land and about 8% of sea areas, marine areas, to 30% and 30% by 2030. And we're hoping and we're pushing for the COP15 discussions, which are going to take place very shortly in Canada, that this will be adopted as a global target for protected areas. We said here, it says enabling transformative change. That means that we've really pushed the financing, and I'll have a slide on that later, within the European Union to support nature and biodiversity much more. We're talking about going up to 10% of all spending specifically on biodiversity by 2027. Here it says EU for an ambitious global agenda. This whole biodiversity strategy and the things we're delivering are our deliverable for COP15. This is what we're saying. This is what we're doing in Europe. This is what we feel everyone should do. And the restoring nature, if you can go to the next slide, I'll give a bit more detail on that. That's really saying that protection we've worked out is not enough. You can't just protect some areas and ignore everything else. Actually, a lot of areas have gone beyond the limits of their sustainability, and we actually need to restore a lot of our different areas. This is we're calling it a reinforced approach. So we've come forward with legally binding targets for nature restoration. But one of the things that's also reflected in the biodiversity strategy, super important, is for the first time really strongly emphasized how important urban ecosystems are, how important cities are. So we see them not as biodiversity deserts, but actually as potentially havens for biodiversity positive places where we can really help our bird and pollinator species to thrive. And then, of course, there's all the other benefits that biodiversity and nature provide in cities, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Haven't got too long. But the first thing I want to say is that, so in the biodiversity strategy, the European Commission called on all cities in Europe with over 20,000 inhabitants, but really all cities, to come forward with ambitious urban greening plans. And this morning, we launched our guidance document saying what an urban greening plan should consist of, in our view. That is a guidance document with a toolkit, and it's talking through the different stages that make an urban greening plan. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see a picture showing the different steps. This is going to be available for anyone, obviously, to look at and use and download, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. In the chat, when I finish speaking, I'll put a link, and next week that will go live, and you'll be able to see all the things we're doing on urban nature and biodiversity, and you'll be able to see this step-by-step process of developing an urban greening plan, which is about securing a long-term political commitment, working with the people in the city and around, having an integrated approach, having a vision, then setting indicators and targets on your urban green space, your tree canopy cover, and lots of other things which you could do and think about in the local context. And then actually having a monitoring, reporting system and adopting it and publishing it. So really, we're going to be pushing this process, this thing to say this is a way to have an ambitious urban greening plan and to help support the aims and objectives of our biodiversity strategy. So that's one part of our push. So if you go to the next slide, the other big thing is our nature restoration law. When targets, you have targets for 10, 20 years and nothing happens and they don't work because they are voluntary targets, the next sort of obvious solution is to make them mandatory and enshrine them in law. And that's what we've done with the nature restoration law. Its headline objectives are to have this continuous long-term and sustained recovery and the restoration of all ecosystems, all key ecosystems in the European Union. It is the first of its kind. It's very ambitious. And I think it needs to be because we're in such a difficult sort of situation. The aim is that by 2050, there will be measures in place for all ecosystems in need of restoration. So we've got, essentially, we're talking about a coverage of a complete system. So not just a few protected areas, not just a few species or habitats, but we're going to be looking at the whole lot. We're building on our birds and habitats directives, which have been tremendously successful in many ways for the last 20 years, and we're taking it a step further. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just show you the different specific ecosystems which we're covering. So we've got the ones covered by existing legislation, birds and habitats directives, marine ecosystems, rivers, pollinators, agro-ecosystems, forest ecosystems, and really key here is the urban ecosystems. Haven't got too long, so I'm going to go to the next slide. So much to say.
Yep, we have 1 minute.
I've got 1 minute.
Or maybe you have to speak faster, Ben.
Yeah, the urban ecosystem targets so that there will be no net loss of green space by 2030 in municipalities which are classified as cities or towns and suburbs. This, for me, is a really big thing, and it will make a lot of towns and cities are already planning green and thinking about green spaces, but some are not so much, and this will help urban development really think with a green hat. Our aim is not to stop urban development. That is something that there are lots of people moving into cities. Cities need to grow, but what we want is that they grow green and they really think about their green space. We've got 2 targets from 2040, 2050 to actually increase the green space quite significantly. So that's also in there. So we're going to have to go to the next slide, unfortunately, because I haven't got too much time. The European Union is backing these restoration targets, including for cities with financing. So we're actually increasing the financing significantly, which is available for nature and biodiversity. 10% of the budget financing towards biodiversity, that's the aim by 2026, 2027. But it's not expensive in the long run. If you've got a strategic long-term plan, it's actually cheaper, because you're building resilience to heat shocks, you're reducing your dependency on certain things like energy, you're reducing your flood risk reduction. Nature-based solutions are a fantastic way to cool cities, to reduce flood risk, and air and water pollution as well, not to mention those extraordinary importance of nature and biodiversity for mental and physical well-being. And that's just the beginning. And then and nature and biodiversity, everyone struggled for decades to put a value on it, but I can give you a value right now. For the first time ever, I can tell you that it's invaluable. You cannot put a price on your nature and biodiversity. We must protect it. Go to the next slide, which is my last slide. So I've done it. I'm only a couple of minutes late. Sorry about that.
Thanks very much, Ben, and also for the enthusiasm. And I think you can be enthusiastic because I think we all were happy when we saw for the first time there is something that's binding, that's coming up. We have quantified targets because we know that we totally failed in the last 10 years with the previous biodiversity strategy, and it does not work if you just do it as a voluntary thing. So it's great to see what's the ambition of the European Commission. We also hope that the member state will see it in the same way and will improve the law.
Exactly.
And we're hopefully not getting overridden again by agriculture or maybe other sectors that have other priorities. So many thanks, and also for the urban greening plans. I think that's also something to share, which will we share with all the participants, because it was just launched, the urban greening plans, the guidance and the toolkit that has been prepared by the Commission together with ICLEI and Eurocities.
Exactly.
So this is really great. If you have a few questions, I don't know, Ben, if you can stay a few more seconds with us.
Oh yeah, I can stay.
Maybe
stay, definitely.
I would invite you, if you have questions to Ben, this is the moment to put it in the Q&A session. I would ask Ben, because I know he does it always quite well. He would respond to your questions right in the Q&A.
I can, yeah, and in the chat.
Yes, and the chat,
happy.
we will, if you put something in the chat, we will manage that it also ends up in the Q&A session. Because we have some limitation. And now I will hand over to Marianne. Sorry, for the 3 minutes delay. Marianne will, it's also my fault, will moderate the session on economics of nature-based solutions and restoration. And just for the people who came later, you find below a little globe. And if you click on the globe, you will be able to either have a Spanish translation to Spanish or to Portuguese. Just use it. So below it's this globe where it's called interpretation for Spanish and Portuguese. Marianne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here on behalf of the REGREEN project. We are having a session of about an hour on the economics of nature-based solutions and restoration. And I think that really goes well in hand with we need to upscale. So what's the economics of this and how to get markets involved and what are the limitations of that? So nature-based solutions in cities provide largely public or common goods and services, but with limited direct revenue streams, such as for heat mitigation or flood protection, or also recreation, health and well-being. Cities don't get the money directly in their coffers. So how to make this work? Also, the location of nature-based solution matters a great deal in terms of who gets to profit for nature-based solutions. So there's also a great aspect of social resilience and equity when talking about the economics of investing in nature-based solution. And what we find is that detailed understanding of these benefits is still needed. So we need to have an exponentially scale up of nature-based solution to meet the policy priorities, both in Europe and Latin America and in China. But it's not evident to create these markets for nature-based solutions. And it's also still difficult to predict how reliable the commercial prospects of NBS can be. And that makes, in turn, the financing for nature-based solutions challenging, both for public entities, but especially when thinking of involving the private sector. So knowledge and evidence about these benefits, costs, and financial performance of NBS is really needed. It remains scattered. It's not easily accessible. And the same goes for functioning financing and incentive mechanism. And also something that we'll hear more about today is the way that we think about business cases for nature-based solutions. It really needs to include a careful understanding of what is the role of public versus private sector in securing public or common goods. So in this session, we'll hear from different projects from REGREEN, INTERLACE, CONEXUS, and Clearing House about how economics and impact evaluation of nature-based solutions can make a difference. We'll hear insights from an economic benefit analysis on heat mitigation benefits. We'll hear about limits to markets for nature-based solutions with perspectives from Europe and Latin America. And finally, we'll hear about the vital role that nature-based solutions can and should play in a nature-positive economy. So I'd like to invite Lily Iliva to the floor. So yeah, we have 4 esteemed speakers in this session, as you'll see on the slide. So the first one is Lily. She's an adaptation specialist in the adaptation unit at UNEP Latin America and in the Caribbean office, where she supports the implementation of UNEP's portfolio on urban nature-based solution for adaptation in the region and collaborates very closely with the CONEXUS project. So she will give a presentation on implementing nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation in cities. And you'll have 10 minutes, and at minute 8, I'll give you a warning of 2 minutes. We have to be strict on this. So I give you the floor, Lily. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Mariam, for this introduction. Thank you very much as well for the kind invitation to form part of this event. I will just try to share. Could you just confirm that you're great?
It works fine.
Yes. Thank you very much on behalf of UNEP and the Office of Latin America and the Caribbean. This is a great opportunity for us to participate and on one side to learn from all the great experience that you are sharing in this event, but also to explore opportunities for collaboration. So, well, the urban context in Latin America within which we are working is shaped by increase in rural-urban migration and climate displacement, significant trends in urbanization as there are 80% of the population living in urban areas. There is poverty, inequalities resulting in increased vulnerability to climate change and risks. And all this is within a scenario, a climate scenario, which is once again showing that there will be increase in magnitude and the frequency of climate hazards such as intense storms and hurricanes and droughts. So within such context, so some cities have actually achieved to embark on climate resilient development pathway, adopting ecosystem-based urban adaptation some examples come from Mexico, for example, Jalapa City, one of our projects being implemented there. However, there are many other cities, in particular medium and small cities, that are having high urbanization rates and really urgent needs for adaptation. Yet, ecosystem approach to urban adaptation is something rather new. And it requires good understanding of the role of ecosystems and their values in reducing climate risks. So it is really a great opportunity here to strengthen these elements and be able to inform local decision makers. Within this context as well, in March 2022, the increasing interest in understanding the economic benefits of nature-based solutions, as well as the cost effectiveness of such interventions, was addressed in the 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. And so within this discussion, it resulted into the resolution regarding nature-based solutions, which really highlighted as well aspects including cost effectiveness, resource efficient interventions, and so on. Yet based and having these advances, nature-based solution interventions often produce a mix of multiple benefits, in particular for urban context, some of which are really difficult to quantify in monetary terms. And I think Ben was mentioning this very correctly in the morning. It is invaluable, and we are looking for opportunities how to best inform decision makers to integrate such solutions within urban planning. This is just a snapshot of what some of the key reports are mentioning, such as the State of Finance for Nature and Adaptation Gap Report, the need for investments in nature-based solutions to triple by 2030 if we would like to actually meet the climate change challenge and biodiversity and land degradation targets. So in our experience, we see the need for a guidance to bridge this gap between the nature-based solution performance and economic valuation in order to really be able to make the case for nature-based solutions at local level, municipalities and key stakeholders. This is an overview of our work, our portfolio on urban nature-based solutions in the Latin America and the Caribbean region. We are currently implementing 2 projects, one of which is under JEF funding, CITIEDA being implemented in Mexico, El Salvador, and Jamaica. And Nature for Cities is a Readiness Green Climate Fund project, which is implemented in Panama, Honduras, Guatemala, Ecuador, Uruguay, and the Dominican Republic and Cuba. And altogether, we work with around 16 cities in all these countries, and we are following kind of an urban NBS model. You may see here we are developing NBS pilots, understanding well what are the validation of concepts in order to develop some solid technical models which we can demonstrate and make a business case for the implementation and scaling up of such solutions. And then we are exploring opportunities for making the financial case in order to scale up and have a much wider impacts and promotion of kind of a framework for urban development, considering urban NBS strategies. Here are some opportunities and areas for collaboration. And once mentioning, it's really great to be here and to explore these opportunities and to learn from you. We are in the beginning of 2023, we will be launching a MOOC course on integrating nature-based solutions in urban adaptation planning. We will be publishing a book on urban nature-based solutions in Latin America and the Caribbean. And thank you very much here for the great contribution of Tom to one of the chapters. With this book, we will be able to present more than 10 case studies from cities in the LAC region on different topics, from vulnerability analysis to financing instruments, valuing nature-based solutions, and engagement with different stakeholders. In the same line, we are also forming a community of practice on urban nature-based solutions with thematic multi-stakeholder tables. We are working very closely with local stakeholders, so we would like to support their efforts in transforming the current urban development models into ecosystem-based urban adaptation models. And we will be focusing as well one of the thematic groups on financing and economics of nature-based solutions. And maybe last but not least, we are developing and of course documenting highlights and best practices regarding the integration of nature-based solutions in policy instruments, exactly to create those enabling factors for upscaling, for incentivizing nature-based solutions in engagement with diverse stakeholders. And also we are working on understanding better what is the financial panoramic view with regards to financial instruments in urban settings and how they can be tailored and adjusted to integrate and to incentivize nature-based solutions, as well as engage with the private sector. So we are doing these exercises, I would say, with all those 16 cities, and we will be happy to share experiences at a later stage. I think I managed for my for my 10 minutes. But yes, thank you very much. And I'm happy to respond to any questions that might appear.
Thank you very much, Lily. You did it within 8 minutes even, so I didn't get to do my 2-minute warning. But thank you very much, Lily, for talking about this pathway from impact to economic benefits and cost effectiveness and resource efficiency. I think it was really interesting to hear your work on what is coming up on the resources for the MOOC, your upcoming book on urban and nature-based solutions, about your community and practice and the best practice cases from 16 cities. That's really a great need for that kind of evidence from the ground. So thank you very much. We'll have you most welcome to add in questions right now, but we'll have a panel discussions toward the end of this session. So I'll invite our next speaker. Thank you very much, Lily. Is Tim Taylor. Tim is giving a presentation on the economic benefits of mitigating heat waves with green infrastructure with insights from Paris. And Tim is a senior lecturer in environmental and public health economics at the European Centre for Environment and Human Health in the University of Exeter Medical School in the UK, with a long-standing experience in the application of economics to the analysis of environment and health issues. And Tim is working on the REGREEN project along with a lot of other EU projects. So the floor is yours, Tim.
Thank you, Mariana, and good afternoon, everyone. Or bon dia, buenos dias. So today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the valuation of the mitigation of heat waves using parks. It's a joint effort with colleagues across the REGREEN project. And with all these things, they're big interdisciplinary projects. So you may have questions later that I hopefully will be able to answer. So sorry, just do the page down. Okay, so just to give you some broader context, in the REGREEN project, we're trying to understand the benefits from nature-based solutions, and that involves the monetary valuation of ecosystem services, particularly around issues of noise mitigation, air pollution mitigation, urban heat island reduction, which is what I'm going to focus on today. We've also got recreation, flood mitigation, and biodiversity. Now, obviously, green spaces and nature-based solutions have wide impacts, and it's important that we get a handle on how we can value them in order that we can put them in a policy context, or we can think through different ways that we can capture the values from these through payments for ecosystem services or other metrics. So I'm going to focus in, as I said, on the urban heat island. So what we're doing is we're attempting to value the health benefits in terms of mortality reduction from the cooling effects of green spaces. So we have a number of questions we have to ask ourselves. We have to ask ourselves first, how far away can we detect a cooling effect from a park? And how many people are affected? And what's the temperature change that we can expect to see? So we've drawn on spatial temperature data at 13-meter resolution from satellite-based data. We focused in this presentation on 3 specific days in the year in 2019, I think it was, where we had different temperatures in Paris. We had one that was slightly cooler summer day, slightly, well, still warm. The maximum temperature was 27.9. And then we've got a medium hot day and then a very hot day. We merged the temperature data with publicly available green space data. And you can see here a map of Paris with the Seine running through it. And we also needed data on the mortality rate, so the number of people dying per 1,000 of the population. And to get an estimate of how the population living around parks is impacted by the temperature changes, we also needed to estimate the populations by buildings so that we could figure out how many people are impacted in different areas around these green spaces. We then need to think through, well, how do we value health? And how do we value mortality? Now, we've employed the value of statistical life in this case, which gives us a value of around about 2.5 million euros to 3.3 million euros for each life. Now, clearly there are debates about how we value mortality. Some would suggest that for something like heat, we might value it in terms of a few months of life loss. But for now, we've just applied it in terms of the value of statistical life, and we may add that in at a later stage. We also needed to estimate the relationship between heat and mortality, and we drew on an existing paper by Mathilde Pascal, and she kindly, her team had analyzed the effect of temperature on mortality at different temperatures, and here you can see from her paper the graph, and that they re-estimated their data to give us the impacts of different temperature changes going up, so that we had more of a more data to base this on. First, we had to think about, well, how do we estimate the impact on temperature of a park or green space? Well, how we did that was we looked at the temperature over different distances and saw where the maximum buffer distance was in terms of the first peak we saw in the temperature going out from a particular green space. So in this case, the maximum buffer distance was 200 meters from this particular park. And we can see on the left-hand side the temperature gradient. So there's a in this case it's about a 0.9 degree difference in total, with different effects at different distances. So when we put all that information together, we can estimate for a given day the impact on mortality and then the economic value associated with that mortality. And here we've mapped it out in different colors. Now I'm quite colorblind, I'm afraid, so I'm not so great at this, but we can see that bigger spaces typically have a higher value, and that's in part because of their size, so that they have a greater impact on temperature. They also have a different effect, a larger space over which to spread their effect. And you can see that the values differ quite a lot between the different spaces. So our next steps are to scale this up to all green spaces in Paris and for all hot days. So at the moment in this picture, we've just got the ones in central Paris. We now have a data set for the wider Paris region, which we're going to use. So far we've only applied it for 3 hot days. Now we're going to extend that analysis to estimate the value across the year in terms of the impact on heat of all parks. And then we're going to apply it to other urban living labs that we're working with. So we're particularly working with Paris, Aarhus, and in Denmark, and with Velika Gorica in Croatia. And we're going to see how applicable the same methodology is for those other regions, given the differing impacts in terms of temperatures. I hope that's given you a bit of an introduction to how we valued the urban heat, and I'll hand back to Mariana.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. You also stayed within 8 minutes, so I didn't get to do the 2-minute warning for you either. How disappointing. Thank you very much, Tim, for showing this example of how to go about valuing in economic terms the cooling effects of urban green infrastructure and the resulting health benefits. And it really does require interdisciplinary approaches to do this kind of work, and understanding the impact of challenges on human health through the relative risk of mortality in this case, and what impact green infrastructure actually has to reduce urban heat islands. So I also think that your work really shows the importance of location of nature-based solutions and who gets to benefit from those. And it's those close to big urban parks and who are living close to big urban parks. We know prices go up. It's a certain segment of population living there. So this is also a big, good work on showing the economic impacts of doing just that. So thank you very much, Tim. And audience, please write questions in Q&A, and Tim will be able to reply to those, and also in our panel discussion. So I welcome our next speaker, David Barden. David is a senior research scientist with the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, NINA. And so David's research focuses on the mapping and monetary evaluation of ecosystem services and urban system ecosystem accounting. And David works in the INTERLACE project and will now give a talk on limits to markets for nature-based solutions, perspectives from Europe and Latin America. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, it works fine.
Great. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak. Developed this presentation with my colleague Marion Kruse in a work package where we're looking at policy instruments for encouraging nature-based solutions on private property. And that gives rise to this title of Limits to Markets for Nature-Based Solutions. And the case studies in INTERLACE are from European and Latin American cases, and we're working on guidelines which will be presented next year in August. See if I can. So I'm going to do a very quick tour of what I mean by a business case and market conditions for nature-based solutions. I'll speak very briefly about the challenges of nature-based solutions in urban settings. I'll provide an example of a market-based nature-based solution, and then use that as an example for discussing some limitations, and finally finish with what we're doing regarding INTERLACE's work on in our partner cities on finding policies for private nature-based solutions. The reason to frame this narrative like this is because in the work we've been doing so far with INTERLACE's partner cities, we've found very few examples of nature-based solutions implemented on private by private property owners at their own initiative and with their own funding, which is a basis and a precondition for market-based provision of nature-based solutions. I guess what I want to do is, in 10 minutes, you can't really do a scientific presentation, so it's more of a political pitch. And what I'd like to question is the concept of business cases for nature-based solutions. Business cases for nature-based solutions are present in most EU-funded research projects on urban green space, and the nature-based solution definition is very broad, so it captures in its present use both public and private policy and public and private financing. It also covers community-based measures. But what I'd like to say is that the business model that describes this rationale for how organizations create and deliver and capture value, it still has its weak point regarding financial viability, and all of the definitions of business models discuss and emphasize the role of profitability for nature-based solution uptake. And there's been a lot of good work already done on the market failures in generating financial feasibility for nature-based solutions. And the main market failures are that any nature-based solution innovations that are developed by private firms are subject to knowledge spillovers, which makes it difficult for a particular firm investing in nature-based innovations to capture all the returns from their investment, which leads to investor uncertainty. The second one, which I'm going to focus on today, is that probably quite well known, but I'm going to revisit it, which is that the ecological public goods delivered by nature-based solutions, by definition, are not commodifiable or marketable. And the final big market failure is that many or even most of these nature-based solutions require infrastructure investments with high upfront costs, and what they produce are long-term public good benefits. So there are no short-term financial returns, or very few, which means that it's difficult to obtain private equity to fund them. And I realize that there are many good exceptions to this generalization, but I wanted to raise a question about the business case narrative in this presentation to provoke debate a little bit. The business case, well, as I said previously, value capture is key to the three aspects of a definition of a business model, which is a value proposition, value delivery, and value capture. Finding out what different actors' value propositions are, what public sector's values are, what firms' values and what citizens' values are is not per se difficult, and it's expressed in many contexts through democratic process, in research projects, etc. And you can also express it and break it down into the kinds of environmental, social, and economic benefits that are expected. It's also not, it's not easy, but it's not impossible to define how green infrastructure and nature-based solutions can deliver value, and specifically how they deliver ecosystem services, how they supply ecosystem services, and to quantify ecosystem services with different metrics, including ecological and environmental benefits, social benefits, and to value those ecosystem services, as we just saw from Tim's presentation, in economic terms. But where the big weak point in the business case approach is the value capture, and particularly value or revenue generation. Value capture in business case definition also includes capturing or generating information which is useful for users to make good decisions in terms of use and planning of urban space, but to convert those users into customers and to find goods and services that are exclusive and rival in the sense that you can generate commodifiable goods and services. That's the clincher. And what we find and see is that most of the funding which is providing revenues for nature-based solutions is public funds. And when we talk about revenue capture for business, it's usually capturing public funds, not actually capturing or selling and responding to demand through customers' willingness to pay. So I'd like to just provoke a debate again, revisiting Ostrom's and also a well-known scheme on the differences between public goods, common pools resources, private goods, and toll or club goods. The argument and what we find in most of the literature is that most of the ecosystem services have low rivalry and subtractability, and it's difficult to exclude potential benefits from enjoying them, which means that most of them are public goods. The symbology here is illustrated. Cultural ecosystem services are in pink, regulating ecosystem services in green, biodiversity, habitat-related functions and services in violet, and the provisioning services in blue. And I would like to argue that for some of these public goods to become common pool resources, you need collective action. And for some of these public goods to be marketable in the sense that you can start charging for them in the sense of a toll and club good, you can, for example, capture a real estate amenity value, or you can charge for tourism destinations linked to parks. You need public regulation rights and rights allocation in order to do that. So the role of the public sector is both in providing most of the funding, in setting up collaborations with or facilitating collective action, and also establishing regulation and rights allocation that make markets possible. And the provocation here is that the field of action for private goods, marketable goods, is very small related to what the benefits we're dealing with. Just one small example from an actual nature-based solution market case study in Oslo that colleagues have done on the pilot procurement auctions for sustainable drainage systems. We see here the private willingness to pay is limited and that public co-funding is necessary. You see the columns on the left-hand side, the different kinds of sustainable drainage systems, including nature-based solutions. Thank you. And the need for the private willingness to pay covers a small fraction of the actual cost of the measures, and most of the measures have to be implemented through public subsidy. And I guess what I'm saying is that nature-based solutions are rarely business models in the sense of customers paying for ecosystem services. The business model language in nature-based solution policy emphasizes the role of private firms, customers, commercial feasibility, and market-based policy instruments. And I would say that, and as we've seen, nature-based solutions are mostly not commodifiable nor financially viable. And I would say that the nature-based solution, the business model language is underestimating the need and the role of an entrepreneurial state and the role of collective action and stewardship. And in some sense, business model language is crowding out the role of an entrepreneurial state and the public sector, and also crowding out the role and purpose of collective action and community stewardship when we do policy analysis. And this argument is inspired by Mariana Mazzucato on debunking public versus private sector myths. So what we're doing in INTERLACE, and it's quite difficult, is finding examples of in small to medium cities that are part of the project where public policies are making private nature-based solution investment possible, and we're in a way redefining what we mean by a business case in terms of looking at policies that promote private nature-based solution investments. And that's a combination of policy mix of legislative, regulatory and strategic instruments, knowledge, communication, innovation instruments, agreement-based or cooperative instruments. And finally, there is a role for financial and economic instruments, but it's by no means dominant. So that's my presentation. Thank you. And I ran over the time and you were able to use your 2-minute warning.
Yes, thank you very much, David. That was really interesting. And also nice to hear these provocative and thought-inspiring views and knowledge that you provide us. And I think it's really interesting that only few examples of NBS in private property that you have in the INTERLACE project, and that you question the business case and the models for NBS, that we actually underestimating the role of the collective state, of the entrepreneurial state. So these public goods that are not commodifiable and that it requires infrastructure investment is also something that cities definitely need. It's a lot of different landowners, but there's a very heavy planning and regulation requirement to make NBS scaled up. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion after our next speaker. So as before, if you have questions to David, please do write them in the Q&A now. And I'll invite our fourth speaker, Daniela Rizzi. Daniela is a senior officer for nature-based solutions and biodiversity at ICLEI Europe, working in both the REGREEN project, CONEXUS and INTERLACE, and I think also Clearing House. You're actually working in all 4 projects. Brilliant. You have a background, Daniela has a background in architecture and urban landscape planning, and focuses on nature-based solution mainstreaming and capacity building for local governments, practitioners, civil society, organization, academia, and SMEs. And Daniela will give a talk on the role of nature-based solutions in a nature-positive economy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marianne. Now, unfortunately, I'm not in Clearing House, but I really like that project as well. So very happy to be here today with all these projects, talking about such important topics. I'll bring today this discussion on how NBS can help to fuel the nature positive economy and in fact even have some kind of protagonism there. Because at the moment there are other agendas that are taking the nature positive economy discourse, and I think it's very important for us, the NBS community, to discuss how we can contribute. Marianne, I hope I can keep my 8 to 10 minutes. Just a little bit, what is the nature positive economy? There are many definitions out there. We grabbed usually this one from the University of Cambridge, is one in which businesses, governments, and others take action at scale to reduce and remove the drivers and pressures fueling the degradation of nature. And we work to actively improve the state of nature and of ecosystem services it provides. So a lot of this discussion around the nature positive economy is really like, how can we have an economy based on actually bringing more nature back, you know, to our planet, instead of, you know, only exploiting nature. So here, I just want to mention that this Business at Biodiversity group is discussing like a working definition, and they're actually gonna next week at this EBNS event discuss with many different businesses and sectors what this could mean for the business context as well. So you see that this is very much being shaped and discussions are ongoing. But one thing is like maybe easily to keep in mind is that the question, how can you have more nature? The baseline can be more nature in 2030 than it is today. We always like to quote here what John Bell said about the role of this whole discussion. So he says that a growing number of businesses are making the case for nature-based solutions, but it is time to move from a niche to a broader movement. So I think we have a lot to discuss with David from the provocations he did before, and yes, and with the other speakers and the audience. We have worked on this publication. We had the inputs from 107 respondents from all over the world. So although it was a project funded by the EC, consultation process happened with a very global audience. And in fact, we also had some case studies from 17 different NBS projects in this publication. And what happened here is that we are working within this task force 3 on governance, business models, and financial mechanisms. I'm representing the REGREEN project in this task force. And what we put together here was recommendations for policymakers. How can we, you know, we can change the discourse of exploring nature towards one that creates more nature. So we have been analyzing also the policy context for this. You're gonna see that not all the policy processes are being flashed here on this slide, but we want just to call the attention that, of course, it was necessary to contextualize the concept of nature-based solutions, nature-positive economy, and nature-based enterprises in this global policy context. So you see here, of course, we have dived into the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, the EU Green Deal in a more European scenario, and of course, the Biodiversity 2030 strategy, restoration law. So we think that all these different policy instruments actually speak to what we want to bring forward with NBS for Nature Positive. And also the whole discussion of around COP CBD 15. So as Ben said today, it's going to be like the big, you know, agreement for biodiversity and for nature is coming up. And we really hope that NBS can be flashed there as a big vector for nature positive economy. And what do we mean by this? One of the things that we have been pushing a lot for is, of course, we saw growing demand from many different countries around the world and sectors. So because NBS is growing in different policies and it's coming into media, and we also have a lot of greenwashing because a lot of opportunistic discourses are taking use of the term. But we haven't seen a lot of growth in investment. So we always show this, showing that 40% today is coming from the private sector, whereas we have 86% from the public sector. And we hope that by 2030, we can really like raise a lot, you know, the investment in NBS, both in private and public sectors. You can see here, yeah, how many, all of you know, how many societal challenges nature-based solutions can drive. And the whole concept of nature-based enterprises is exactly about that, about enterprises that really have as the main mission environmental and social goals first. Which is different from normal enterprises where economic goals usually go first. Yeah, to put it very simply, NBEs want to maximize environmental and social impact, whereas the other ones are really looking for economic benefits. And maybe they go as far as to say, do no harm to nature. But the nature positive discourse really is not enough to say do no harm. We really have to restore and bring nature back and biodiversity back where it's already been gone. So, and this is, I just want to mention, I'm not going to dive into this because of time, but there's a very nice paper from McQuaid and the group about the framework conditions for nature-based enterprises. So they have studied the influencing factors and the barriers that enterprises are facing today, a little bit in the lines of the previous presentation. So what are the biggest hurdles that enterprises are facing? And we're going to put this in the references for people to check. The NBS market, if you see it from the supply side, you have many different sectors that are working with nature-based solutions. Here you can see in the screen. And what we can say for sure that the term is still very much being matured, whereas time goes by. But we have noticed that these sectors are very different in terms of maturity. So you have some of the sectors that are already working with the term a bit longer and have a clarity of how the nature-based thinking is being reasoned, and other sectors are really pretty much in a very initial phase. And we have seen, and you're going to see the recommendations of the publication, that we really need sector-related capacity building, and also, yeah, really research groups, and to make sure that these sectors can keep on developing. Some examples from, yeah, 1 minute. I want to really highlight the importance that we called for in this publication to really respect international perspectives, because the nature positive economy is not understood in Europe the same way it's understood in China or in Latin America. And so it was very important for us to hear voices from different contexts and bring these into the publication. And we saw also the importance of networks and partnerships. I'm not going to dive into this because I have like 30 seconds or something, but I want to mention here the Connected Nature Enterprise platform that has been trying to put communities to get active and discuss with one another. Also the Urban by Nature program, which has been launched in 9 hubs at the moment. And last but not least, we need standards for sure, because there is misuse of terminology, there is greenwashing. We know that the Network Nature Project is calling for the quality of NBS. So we need really metrics so that we can dive into measurement and valuation in a way that is standardized. Public policy needs to pretty much highlight cross-sectoral and integrated policies. We need more investment, as I said in the beginning of the presentation. And capacity building and awareness is also key, because there's a lot of lack of awareness at the moment around NBS and the economic potential in particular. So yes, with this, I want to say thank you, and just want to show here the references. We're going to put some links on the chat, and we can keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniela, for this talk on creating a nature positive economy. And I think in our panel here, or among your speakers, it's given the very different angles of how to look at this perspective, both from is this possible, what is needed, and then actually showcasing all those enterprises working for a high quality environment or depending on a high quality environment. So thank you very much, Daniela, and I'd like all the panelists to put on their cameras, thanks. And we have just almost 10 minutes. So I would like to ask Lily, David, Tim, and Daniela. So we've heard about these different perspectives, but I'd like to see how you individually think about those limitations and perspectives of creating a nature positive economy, given that it's our public goods and services that are in dire form, that's really being degraded, that we need to increase, and given the private sector nature. So how do you see the perspectives and limitations of economics and markets in advancing nature-based solution and restoration in cities? Who would like to go first?
I can jump in.
Yeah, please.
So I'm going to recede or retract from my very aggressive standpoint of dissing business models a little bit, but I just wanted to raise the awareness that the repeated use of the language of business models is alienating collective action communities. Market-based instruments is subordinating the very important role of public regulation, which can create business opportunities. And the continued language of business cases as a source of revenue for funding is underestimating, or rather detracting the attention from the need to actually finance public budgets to both fund implementation, to provide subsidies on private land, and to carry out good regulations and monitoring of what mostly are public goods. So I'm not saying that you can't do nature-based solutions on private land. I'm just saying that this language that we've been using and that's promoted by the European Commission in our research projects can crowd out what are the main mechanisms of providing these ecosystem services in urban contexts.
Okay, so it's the discourse of how to frame this crunch of actually getting enough financing, be it on public or private land, to enhance public goods. So it's this discourse that we need to reflect upon.
We need to use it critically and at the appropriate moments, and in other settings we need to use discourse on social ecological systems, on stewardship, on common property resource management, etc.
I was wondering, Lily, do you have a view on this, given all those partners that you're working with in Latin America?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I think we can certainly draw from the experience we have working in particular with local stakeholders. So all the project we are implementing, we work very closely with municipalities, with the technical staff, with the local stakeholders, NGOs and civil society organizations. And we certainly see kind of a need for a better understanding, of course, of what is the value added of nature-based solutions in urban areas for adaptation. And with this, we see the need for a rather more possibly regional specific information, something that can guide as well, the development of different methodologies, the different assessment and maybe more participatory oriented assessment evaluations of the nature-based solution impacts. and their cost effectiveness, so that we can really engage stakeholders in understanding what would be the role of nature-based solutions of healthy ecosystems for their cities, depending, of course, on scale. But yes, we see those possibly limitations, of course, not to mention limited capacities and knowledge on such a still rather innovative terminology that comes as something very promising, but it's at times a bit challenging to be communicated and to have the support of local yes, administrative staff, let's say, or stakeholders. So this is, I guess, as maybe as limitations, as perspectives. Of course, we would like to see yes, the more evidence, I would say, and this is really something I'm seeing throughout the discussions today, of how can we really approach this gap in between what really is needed with regards to financial gap for adaptation in urban areas, and how nature-based solutions and their positive impacts can really contribute to closing this gap. So,
yeah, great. Thank you. So is this both, there's this financing gap that even if we have the evidence, there still needs to be the financing needed, but even getting to the evidence of what is the value added, what are the impacts of NBS, that is kind of the first step in this approach that you're doing. And I was wondering, Tim, your work on valuing the health impacts of reducing urban heat island, how do you think that can change for cities if that evidence is being made much more widely known? So those numbers, we kind of all know generally that trees and parks lead to lower temperatures, but actually getting those numbers out there and do their work, what do you see the perspectives and limitations of that?
Well, I think it has its advantages in terms of giving a perspective on the multifunctional values that these spaces give. Because once you add those together with some of the other values that you get, the values rise. But the only issue is, of course, that there is a question as to who bears the cost and who bears the benefits of these. Increasingly, we're being asked actually to provide more on actual health cost savings. So based on the kind of cost of illness type measures rather than necessarily the mortality based, because those are felt to be closer to what decision makers understand rather than the kind of more, how can you put it, value of statistical life is always considered to be a little bit more obscure because it's valuing the welfare benefits, which is always, it's further from the market than a true cost borne by a system. But I think the other problem is that different actors in these cities really need to work together, and that's difficult. That's difficult.
Yeah. And that's interesting, this thing of working with welfare economics and actually working instead with some evidence, some economic evidence of impacts that are direct notion and relevance for cities, for the health systems, that you can actually save health costs to an already health system that's under a lot of strain. So that's interesting. Daniela, what do you make of this? When you think about the nature positive economy, you show all the different sectors that are part of that, but the problem, you could argue, is coming from somewhere else, right? The enterprises that use nature as a resource that we just imagine as renewable, and we don't think about the externalities.
Yeah.
I think the perspectives of this nature positive economy, what is needed to really make it work across the whole economy?
Yeah, sometimes I think we should flip a little bit the discourse and ask ourselves, why in the hell are not all enterprises in the world, you know, not only not harming nature, but also helping to restore it in some way in their value chains, right? Why are we not doing everything the other way around, right? I mean, we do have some initiatives out there, like, for example, the TNFD, this Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. And this is basically going to ask from enterprises that they really show if their activities are harming nature and in what way they're doing that. And that's starting with enterprises, but cities and local governments are going to be the next ones that are going to be asked to report. So there's already this TCFD, because we know that the climate agenda is a little bit more established than the biodiversity agenda. And enterprises are already being asked, you know, to report. And I mean, of course, we have to report on biodiversity as well, right? We have to check if our activities are, you know, in any way fast forwarding biodiversity laws, or if we're happy to restore it. So I think there are going to be a lot of regulations coming up. I hope that with COP15, we're going to set up some, you know, really sturdy, let's say, targets, you know, for the whole globe. But if you see, even like the presentation that Ben said before with the EU restoration law, the restoration law is going to ask from European governments that they really do something. So we're going to need markets. We're going to need people knowing the services, knowing how to deliver the project for nature-based solutions. We're going to need this kind of professionals more and more. It's not going to be like, oh, if I'm feeling hippie today, I'm going to call my friend who can do NBS. No, it's going to be really a requirement. And yeah, so I know there is a huge challenge, but I guess we really have to face it, right? And be. We cannot wait anymore. It's really, the situation is really, yeah, no time. We have to do it for yesterday.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. That actually gives a very good link to the next session that is coming on, which is on policy governance and institutional issues. Markets can't operate without a regulation. There's no such thing as a free market. And especially when it comes to nature, biodiversity and restoration, regulation is needed. And I think that's what came out through all your talks. There is a number of questions out in the Q&A, and I would like you to ask if you could look at them while we go on to the next session. I'm sorry, audience, that we did not take the time to take them up and discuss, but I hope there'll be an eager discussion out on the Q&A. And I'd like to thank you for the speakers for providing your insights, your experience, your recommendations, and your blunt views on this very intricate topic. And I'd like to give the floor to Sandra Naumann. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianne, and well, thanks also for doing the introduction, actually, of the session. So I would have actually had the same words. So we need like suitable policy and institutional frameworks, right, to support the implementation of nature-based solutions across sectors and scales. And this raises questions like what governance policy tool exists, which have been proven effective. Can they be replicated also in other cities? What role maybe nature-based solution standards could play in this regard? And what are also the challenges that our city faces, not just in Europe, but also in other parts of the world in creating effective policy frameworks and also working together with the different stakeholders at different scales. And we also have a big question to address, and then is the mainstreaming of nature-based solutions merely wishful thinking? So these are the questions that will be discussed in the session. And Rosa, if you could just quickly put on the agenda for this session so we could see it. And while Rosa is doing that, yes, please also keep posting your question in the Q&A. I saw also that the speakers really efficient in addressing those. So also thanks to the speakers of doing that. I don't know if we can get the overview of this for the agenda also. If not, it's not the end of the world. It's not a problem. Oh, and hey, there we go. Thank you, Rosa, and Johannes. So yeah, I think I will not speak again about economics, but I would prefer the governance slide and the policy. Yes, perfect. Thank you. So first, we will hear about experience from a very new tool that's just coming up soon. It's called the Urban Governance Atlas, which sounds a bit like the Urban Nature Atlas. We will hear about results from studying guidelines for nature-based solutions from Stefan Pauleit. We also will look at the bottom-up perspective and have a nice interview coming up from two nice women from Bogota. And I hope that also will happen, that we have a presentation from Network Nature here with Efra and Phil from Technalia on the NBS standards. And in the end, we also have a very few questions we will discuss in a small round. So many thanks. And with those words, I would like to welcome our very first speaker. And I see Efren. Efren, really nice to see you. You sound already, so Efren will talk about standards. So McKenna Davis is a colleague of mine. She's a senior fellow at the Ecologic Institute in Berlin, and her work focuses on the assessment of nature-based solutions and related approaches, as well as, of course, the surrounding policy governance frameworks. And her expertise extends to European biodiversity and nature protection policies and the links to climate change adaptation with a specific focus on urban environment. And currently, she coordinates the Biodiversa funded project Niches, which focuses on urban nature-based solutions for runoff water management. And she also has a role, an important role in the project Clever Cities and in INTERLACE. And yeah, McKenna, please enlighten us and shed some light. What's this Urban Governance Atlas and what can we take away from it at this very moment?
Thank you, Sandra, for the warm introduction. And Rosa, can I ask you to share the slides, please? Would be great.
Yes.
Great. So I think Sandra did a great job already of framing this session, but I'm going to dive into, as she said, one what I think is a very exciting tool that's coming up now that we're developing within the INTERLACE project. So I'm really happy to be here and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to present today on governing restoration and nature-based solutions with a focus on Europe and Latin America, which is our focus in the INTERLACE project, and share some first insights from this Urban Governance Atlas, which I will tell you in a moment what that is. Next slide, please. Great. So I think right now we've all heard a lot about the recognition about NBS, the potential for it to address different societal challenges. But also there's really a remaining challenge right now and big gaps in trying to translate that ambition really into local policy action. So it's really critical in this context to have the right mix of policy instruments. So I'll talk in a moment about what I mean by that, but also the governance behind those policy instruments. So how they're regulated, who's involved in decision-making, how power is distributed, and aspects like that. So historically, I think we're pretty familiar that governing of green spaces or of urban areas in general has typically been quite top-down. So it's really had a lot of decision-making power given to the public authorities with really limited involvement of the public or wider stakeholder groups. So this has been shifting a lot. I'm really happy to share some good examples today about shifting from this term of government to governance, and really trying to make these participatory processes, trying to involve other stakeholders, recognizing their values, recognizing their knowledge, and recognizing their perspectives within decision-making processes. So in doing this, there was also a review done by the UNILAB project. It's another EU-funded project coming to an end, unfortunately now. And they have a great study out that was talking about policy instruments and doing a review of which instruments exist for nature-based solutions and how these are considered within in practice. And they really found that there aren't specific examples of cases and proven instruments. So our goal within the INTERLACE project was really to address this gap and try to put together a compilation of different policy instruments that are identified according to a set of criteria that we have as being good practices for supporting and fostering a nature-based solution in the urban context. Next slide, please. So here's just a kind of preview of what the Urban Governance Atlas is. To introduce it briefly, as Sandra already gave a little teaser, the name a lot of you will recognize. I think it's quite similar to the Urban Nature Atlas from the Natureation project that we were also involved in developing. And we wanted, that one focuses a lot on nature-based solutions and has a really amazing overview of nature-based solutions now on a global level. And we wanted to complement that and focus more on policy and on the governance side of it. So we now have a dedicated governance atlas focusing on policy instruments fostering nature-based solutions from primarily Europe and the CELAC region, Latin American region, but also including global examples. The atlas, the concept of it, the terminology, the typology of policy instruments I'm going to share in a moment was co-created with different government representatives, representatives of the research community, financial experts, and loads of different individuals. So this is really a co-created instrument. And we're really happy that it will be available in English and Spanish, and hopefully with our lovely DeepL translation available in more languages as well to really have a global uptake and accessibility. So the idea is that by showing examples of good practices of all different types of policy instruments that have worked in practice around the world, we can really work to inspire global action. We can represent diverse contexts. So this is like both institutional context and geographic context. We have quite interestingly really good examples in there, not only of the traditional top-down policy instruments, but also bottom-up policy instruments, which have then been formalized or taken up within the governments, which is quite nice. And then ultimately, obviously, we're trying to foster more inclusive, more coherent planning for green spaces. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go quickly through the 4 types. I think I would invite you, there's a beta version of the Atlas, which the link is in my presentation. I can put it in the chat afterwards, that you can go look at and explore these in more depth. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm trying to be conscious of the time. But just to go briefly through the categories. So we have legislative, regulatory, and strategic instruments. So within this, we have some of the more binding policy instruments. We heard about the EU Restoration Law, which is an example on the EU level of this. So we're looking for these kind of instruments on the local level and the municipal level. And then we also have things like standards in here that Efren will talk about in a moment, urban planning mechanisms, and then different sectoral strategies, in addition to these dedicated strategies, which are really looking at specific strategies, for example, on green infrastructure. And I put actually, I go too quickly through it, I think, to go through all the examples, but on the slides you can look after, there's always an example from the Latin American context in Spanish for our Spanish speakers today, and then a European example as well in English, just for your information. Next slide, please. So the next category, we had the legislative side. Then we also have these economic and fiscal instruments, which fits well with the last session we had. So we have kind of, let's say, the more positive side of things, the payments or subsidies or incentives or different financing mechanisms and market-based instruments. But we also have disincentives trying to discourage behavior through taxes and charges and things like that. And here again are 2 examples. Next slide, please. So the last 2 categories are agreement-based and cooperative instruments, which I personally find the most interesting of all of these categories. They're quite new. There's not that much research on them. We talk all the time about governance and participatory processes, but how does this actually look in action? And in this category, there's quite a lot of examples, more than the other categories, at least, which are coming from bottom-up initiatives. So really, for example, a classic example is of an urban garden where the community says, we would like to do this. They formalize this in a way, get the support from the local municipality, and then it becomes recognized by that municipality. The land is then officially able to be used by these community groups, or sometimes even partly financed by the government. So this is quite interesting. And then the last category are the knowledge, communication, and innovation instruments. So this could be like awareness raising campaigns. It could be guidance, which Stefan will speak about in a moment. And one of our guest speakers, Diana, who will have an interview and later in the session, she'll provide an in-depth look at one example of an agreement-based instrument from Colombia to represent the Latin American context and highlight the lessons learned. So you get to hear a little bit more in depth about an example at that time. Next slide, please. So the part that I really want to focus on, that's kind of where we started. And now I want to show you where we're at now. So that was the ambition. And so far we have, you can see a map here of the countries we have represented in the atlas. We have over 40 countries. We have over 100 municipalities. And so far, publicly accessible, we have over 150 published instruments in both Spanish and English, spread across all of these countries. We also have a list of the remaining instruments that we're going to publish, that we're working on now in process. And if you take that total list of the instruments, we have about 32% from the Latin American context, about 64% from the European context, and then 4% from other regions you can see represented on the map here. One thing I'd like to highlight, because we have our great partners here, also representing this European-Chinese exchange. We don't yet have Chinese examples, so we would be really happy to collect those from our project partners and anyone in the audience who has awareness of those, plus any of the other instruments that you think are valuable and could be shared here. Of course, we're very open to that as well. Yeah, maybe the next slide, please. So we did a quick analysis looking at the total instruments, so not only the ones that are already published, but the ones that we plan to publish and that we have listed so far across, broken up here by the type of policy instruments I just introduced, and then spread across the region. So I break it up here just into EU, CELAC, and other regions for simplicity. I think it's important to notice here that there's really a strong weight or an overemphasis, let's say, on this first classic category. So on the legislative, regulatory, and strategic instruments, and really an underrepresentation, even though they might be available, of the knowledge, communication, and innovation instruments. I think it's important to note as well that these figures are the representation within the database, but of course have no necessary implication or direct connection with what's available in the real world. It's simply a matter of what we have access to. And so from our side, we're always really looking and very happy to get examples of instruments that exist, that are good practices, that have been working well to support nature-based solutions from categories other than this classic legislative group, which we have quite well represented already. So those are very welcome.
And McKenna, you have 2 more minutes.
Oh, okay. Next slide, please. So I'll fly through this one then. I'll give it in the slide afterward, or in the presentation afterwards, to have a look, but it just breaks it down on these kind of subcategories that we have per instrument type. So you can get a better idea. This is across the whole database and all of our instruments. So you can really see what is represented well, what is underrepresented, and where we have a need, let's say, for more action. But I'll skip that one for now. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight a couple of first observations. I have to kindly thank my colleague Natalia, who will speak in a moment, as well, for the inspiration here, who's been instrumental in helping to create the database with us. Once we have a fully populated database, we're going to have a more in-depth analysis, but I just wanted to provide a couple of first impressions so far. So I think one thing to keep in mind that we all know is that there's a lack of direct labeling of nature-based solutions within these policy instruments, especially in the CELAC region. So just an awareness of that. It doesn't mean that they're not being used. They're already being used in a lot of different sectoral objectives to help achieve those. But just to be aware in the search that we're really broadening this for the concept and not the terminology. Then what I mentioned before, that most of these instruments are top-down, but there's a real high potential for more bottom-up approaches that can be taken up by governments and recognized formally. Then there is also what we found a largely untapped potential to utilize multiple policy instruments to complement one another. So really having maybe a tax or an incentive or something positive connected with, for example, incentive awareness raising campaigns, or having guidance out there in order to help implementation and uptake. Then the collaborative governance approaches, these are really common at the regional scale in the CELAC context, but are more common at the local scale in the EU, which is not a good or bad, but interesting to note. And then finally, in terms of the fitting with the last session about payments and subsidies and incentives, these are all more common than disincentives, which is quite nice, actually, to try to encourage positive behavior and positive action rather than just having these penalties for negative actions there. Next slide, please. And then my final slide, just to say that we're still open. We're still putting cases in. We're still really happy to get your input, so it's not too late. We have a lot of guidance available also in Spanish. The entries can be entered in Spanish as well. The online questionnaire, you can find it at the QR code here at the link with instructions. I'm available anytime for questions, and we're really basically counting on this NBS community and all of you out there in the audience to make and populate this database and make it as robust as possible, because sometimes it's quite difficult to find on the ground cases, particularly in the CELAC context. So we're very happy to hear from you, and yeah, I'll wrap it up with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, McKenna. So you cannot hear the applause, but I'm sure it's quite loud. Thanks for the presentation. I think we're all really keen to see it being published very soon. And I think, as McKenna said, it's a living document, and it will be populated over the next years as well. And we hope that will also continue, because there's so many great instruments available, not just in Europe, Latin America, but also other regions. So please share that with us. And yeah, if you're interested, of course, we can also like inform you as soon as it has been published.
I'll put the links in the chat now also.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And McKenna also already like announced more or less the next speaker, which is Stefan Pauleit, who is part of the CONEXUS team. And Stefan will present insights from a review on nature-based solutions guidance documents and tools to transfer knowledge on nature-based solutions and support cities to implement those. Stefan is a professor for strategic landscape planning and management at the Technical University of Munich. His areas are urban ecology, green infrastructure planning, adaptation strategies to climate change in the urban environment, urban forestry and trees. So it's quite a large range of expertise you have. And at the present, Stefan is also the director of the Center for Urban Ecology and Climate Change Adaptation at the Technical University of Munich. Welcome, Stefan, and I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for this overwhelming introduction. My main question is whether I have sufficient expertise to start the slideshow, and I hope it will work now. So thank you very much. I'm going to present a little bit of the CONEXUS project, which is the sister project, as you know, of INTERLACE. And maybe the main difference between the two projects is that we are mainly working with bigger cities, or very big cities like Bogota, Santiago, Sao Paulo, and Buenos Aires in the Latin American context. And then we have 3 cities also in Europe. And of this project, which is of course very much working on the same grounds as INTERLACE, so we are also interested in enhancing the uptake of nature-based solutions in Latin America and in Europe, and to learn collaboratively one from the other. We have one work package that is particularly looking at how to translate all the knowledge that we generate during the project into some sort of guidance, so that transfer to other cities or also uptake within the same cities is enhanced. So now, let's see, yes. In Europe, there are many projects today, mainly funded by the European Union, of course, that promote nature-based solutions. So there's really a movement there in this respect. Still, many of these projects are generating pilot projects, and also there's a big question on how to upscale. How can we support the mainstreaming of nature-based solutions in local practice of urban development? And that's a tricky one, I think, because usually when we talk about, say, the public administration, then the people working there are time constrained, resource limited overall, and so they need good help to really take up this practice, which is beyond what they do normally. Quite often there is a production of guidance materials, and that may be in the form of handbooks, guidelines, manuals, toolboxes, etc. Just 2 examples to illustrate that. In one project in Green Search, we produced a series of guidance or brochures for green infrastructure planning, and then ICLEI published this guidance on urban nature and nature-based solutions. These are just 2 of a great many of these kind of guidances that are available. So our question is, how can we learn mutually from the guidance that is already there as a first step to producing our own guidance later at the end of the project. And if you look at Latin America, perhaps the situation is different from Europe, and that has been mentioned quite a number of times now during these talks. For instance, already McKenna said that nature-based solutions may not be categorized as nature-based solutions in Latin America. So the challenge is already to identify what is nature-based solutions there and which type of guidance to find about them. Also learned lessons may be recorded to a limited extent and funding opportunities fewer and more diverse. The approach that we took in this working package that we are working on is that we did a scanning of the available literature, of the available guidances that are published on the web, but maybe also are known by experts, and so are made known to us then. And we analyzed all of this guidance to find out what are the gaps in content of NBS guidance, in particular in relation to nature-based solutions governance and planning, identify the gaps and potentials between nature-based guidance and the needs for practitioners for guidance, identify the co-learning potentials on nature-based solutions between Latin America and Europe, and provide guidelines for knowledge transfer on nature-based through solutions, through guidance. We found, I will give you the precise number a little bit later, but we found a great number of guidance overall. And here, one of the first results that we got, that is which target groups are addressed. And as you can see, mostly it's municipalities and maybe also regional governments, whereas citizen and communities are not so many guidances about. And then there are some about international agencies and networks and others. But very often, these guidances are just focused on one particular target group. And so some of the questions that we ask now are whether there should be a broader group of stakeholders to be addressed, so that we catch, so to say, the full range of those that are going to develop or should be involved in the development of nature-based solutions. Should be more focus given to multi-scale collaboration? Should questions of inclusiveness and justice be considered more? And should we not give more attention to each level of participation, including informing, raising awareness, and capacity building? The NBS guidance that we looked at closer came both from Latin America. You can see here, we did find in the end 54 documents, but 67 from Europe, and in different languages, of course. And here you see also the distribution of those languages. So it's quite a large amount of guidance of 121 pieces that we analyzed. And we have not finished yet this task. But what you can see here from this slide is how the different challenge areas that nature-based solutions should address are also addressed by these guidances, which can be quite different between the Latin American context and the European context. I don't want to analyze this in detail, the time is missing for that, but you can see that, for instance, participatory planning and governance, which is a broader group, of course, of documents, is addressed here in Europe as a primary aim in nearly 40 documents, and in Latin America in 25. So there are quite some differences between the guidances that we found. And to sum up already, here are some of the potentials for co-learning on developing guidance that we found. And the arrow always points into the direction of who can benefit maybe from learning from the other continent. And so ways to include economic opportunities, but also procedural knowledge, such as on mainstreaming of NBS in policies, ways to move participation from consultation to higher forms of participation, like partnership and empowerment, and ways to improve the collaboration with different types of stakeholders, in particular different levels of governments. That is something where perhaps Latin American cities can benefit from the guidance that is already there in Europe, whereas ways to address social justice and social cohesion and support of participation, in particular of citizens and communities. So at the lower level is perhaps the wrong word, but these stakeholder groups that are not in public administration, ways to develop guidance in a more transparent and inclusive way is something where we can benefit from Latin America. This is the stage where we are at the moment. And in the end, what we plan to do in CONEXUS is to develop a kind of, we call this a little bit bold, ecosystem of guidances, so that address maybe specific stakeholder groups, but also summarize in appropriate formats the quite large range of results that we will get in this project on the development of nature-based solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Stefan, also for being sharing with us so much information in a really short time. It was really impressive. And I think, yeah, it's really the last slide you showed that really illustrates there's a lot to learn between the cities in both regions. I think that's not always clear when cities from different regions starts working together, but in INTERLACE, we have actually the same experience that cities in Latin America have like more than 20 years, 30 years of experience, like really working in an inclusive way with stakeholders at all levels. So, and I think this is a lot that Europe can learn from our cities. So I think it's good. And I think also it requires for more interaction between CONEXUS and INTERLACE, and of course, other cities working on that. So many thanks for that. If you have any questions to Stefan, please feel free to question and answer tool. And I know Stefan will be very active. So we're now leaving actually the meta level, and we'll move from this more top-down to a bottom-up perspective, welcoming Diana Wiesner, who is the key person behind the bottom-up initiative Fundación Cerros Bogotá, which is preserving natural areas in Bogotá. And Diana is a Bogotá-based activist. She is a leader in social ecological issues, an architect and designer renowned for her designs in urban ecology and landscape. And her design work has been awarded and distinguished in several national and international biennials of architecture and landscape architecture. And she also works as a committed citizen in the processes of management of the natural system of Bogotá, and leads the children's node of the Latin American Landscape Initiative. I could talking on, but we have limited time. We're very happy you're here. And to learn about your experience, Diana, and challenges when you established this bottom-up initiative, I invite my colleague Natalia Burgos Cuevas, also from Bogotá originally, but now with us at Ecologic, who will conduct an interview. And Natalia is also an expert on climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, and urban and regional planning. And with those words, Natalia, maybe we can also put you, I will turn off my camera soon, but nice to have also the spotlight on Natalia, to have these two people here in the room, and hand over the talking stick to the two of you.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Hello, Diana. We are very excited to have you here. Me, as a Bogotan, I always look very up to the work that you are doing with Fundación Los Cerros. So as a first question, I would like you to tell us a bit more about the work you are doing there in Fundación Los Cerros. What is this initiative about, and why is this important for all the people of Bogotá?
Thank you, Natalia. Well, our organization seeks to build a civic and ecological culture in a tropical megacity of high mountains, as you know. And in a diverse country like Colombia, we are immersed in a process of reconciliation. So Bogotá, its capital city, requires a concrete and real actions to become a territory of peace, to be more inclusive, equitable, and harmonious with the nature. So our proposal in the foundations is to generate alliances for biodiversity and increase an ecological and citizen culture in the urban border, that it's all the nature reserve of the eastern hills of Bogotá.
Great, thank you. So as a second question, as the audience heard before, we already talked about the Urban Governance Atlas, and one of the best practices that we are featuring there is the Reserva Natural Umbral Horizontes. Could you tell us a bit more about this initiative?
Yes, we call it like a laboratory of collaborative and territorial transformation, because it's like a pilot project that we have done with the Citizens Force. And through concrete actions and participatory restoration strategies, we have been and apply in the mountain, like collective works, art workshops, and weekly the mountains takes the voice for the citizens. So we have been doing this like from the foundation 15 years ago, but here in the reserve more like 7 years, and we carry out free talks for citizens, and we involve children, young people, and everything we have done, it's done collectively.
Great. Many thanks. Anyways, everyone can read the case study in the Urban Governance Atlas beta version that McKenna just shared. And to continue with the questions, we know and we mentioned that it's challenging to kickstart bottom-up initiatives and that then they are recognized by the government. So can you tell us a bit more or a bit on how you managed to do that and to ensure institutional and financial stability?
It's difficult. We need passion, we need commitment and perseverance. And of course, resistance, because all the governments begin with a new idea, and we have to be there in that resistance and that perseverances. And we have formed like a group of people and citizens who are in love with passion and collaborating in a network, and we work in that field. Also things that we have done is to include all communities in inclusive matter and as an integral perspective.
This is great. I can say myself that lots of people in Bogota, they know what you are doing with our mountains, and we really, it's about citizen ownership, right? So as a last question to give a message to the audience, more than 100 people are listening to us, what would you say that is your biggest lesson learned kickstarting a community-based initiative? What would you share with others that would like to do the same in other latitudes? What is your key message that you would like the people to go home with?
I think it's very important to have a supportive and complicit group, and to have with whom we have shared a common interest, and to build a joint vision for the future of the organization, and to be clear and transparent about the interests in participating, not only from the perspective of the common benefit, but also in the personal interests. So everybody have a move to be there, and it's part to be expressed, to respect and have the responsibility, respect the responsibility of each one of the group, and of course, celebrate mistakes and critically evaluate them and go on.
Great, Diana. Many thanks. I think we are on time. I invite everyone to take a look at the entry, and then we have some features in terms of the governance aspects, the lessons learned, and I think this is a very inspiring practice. So many thanks, Diana. Gracias.
Thank you also from my side. And I know Diana has she has a challenging situation because it's not in the office. I think you're in the field at the moment, so really happy that you could still join wherever you are at the moment in Colombia. Please stay also in the line, because we have at the end a small discussion with you and the other speakers. Many thanks, and you were wonderful in keeping the time. And I really I think the phrase I took is like celebrate the mistakes and learn from it. I think that's a wonderful phrase, because usually we try to cover them up. But actually that is like where we learn. And also like what you say, you need passion, you need transparency, you need engaged people, a joint vision. And this is really important to have local stakeholders working together and create ownership. It's certainly always an ongoing challenge, but I would not be surprised if many people now would like to go and visit the nature reserve in Bogota. So please do so. I know some people are working with Bogota, like CONEXUS, and we're also not so far away. So many thanks. And from this discussion, so I was thinking very hard yesterday how I could do a good bridge from this interview to my next speaker. And after 20 minutes, I just realized I don't have a smart idea how to do that. So I will just keep it short. And I'm very happy to introduce Efren Filiou, who will speak about the current discussions and process of standardizing nature-based solutions, which can be a really powerful policy instrument. And we see Efren here. We're really happy that you also could join. Efren Filiou is the Climate Change Adaptation Manager at the City, Territory and Environment area of Tecnaya in Spain, coordinating applied research projects in the fields of sustainable spatial development, nature-based solutions, regional urban resilience, and sectoral climate change adaptation. He has a professional background in consultancy and capacity development for public administration and utilities, being involved in international and European initiatives for more than 20 years. And you are obviously also very engaged in standardization activities. So please go ahead. You have 8 minutes. Efren, but the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen. Let me see if I manage to do so. Okay, 1 second. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay,
looks good.
Thank you very much. I'll try to keep it short and do it quick so we have time for discussion. So, well, during the last years, a lot of activity in the formal standardization world, so ISO, CEN in Europe, has been happening around, firstly, sustainable cities, sustainable city indicators, etc., on one hand, but also lately in the field of climate change adaptation. So climate change adaptation framework, vulnerability and risk assessment, adaptation planning for cities. And well, in that framework of activities, some European projects funded by the Horizon 2020 program have addressed the development of pre-standards or starting some standardization activities in the field of other issues like climate resilience, and well, derived from all that activity in the Clever Cities project about nature-based solutions demonstration projects for inclusive urban regeneration. We also have some, or an activity line around the standardization. And having said that, we also need to mention the Network Nature initiative, which organized a semester in which both quality of nature-based solutions and nature-based solutions standards was addressed during the last 6 months, including activities related to state-of-the-art, a questionnaire, and workshop addressing those two elements, quality of nature-based solutions and standardization. And that is what I'm going to briefly present today. So in these activities, which are framed, as I was saying, in Clever Cities, but also with this impulse of Network Nature semester, what we've done is an extensive review of publications, but also the ongoing European funded nature-based solutions projects with a double approach. On one hand, trying to identify spheres of the nature-based solutions implementation or deployment, which could be subject of standardization, so going from the technical design, the planning, the policy and governance, or financial and economic aspects, and try to identify which type of standards could be developed, or which elements of those different spheres could be standardized in which ways. And And well, there were different standardization categories around terminology, process management, impact assessment, nature-based solutions, design, and technology. Okay, to make it short, after that questionnaire and workshop, but mainly after the questionnaire, there were, trying to do that matchmaking with the matricial approach that I was showing before. Well, there were a number of standardizable elements or issues which were related to those thematic spheres and the different standardization categories. What you see with the red stars are like the outcomes of this analytical process and questionnaire, and also discussions trying to identify priorities of things which could be subject of standardization. As you can see, well, the terminology behind nature-based solutions, technical design, effectiveness assessment, monitoring and evaluation plans, planning processes, scaling up frameworks or strategies, as well as the cost-benefit analysis, were things which were identified as potential priorities for standards development. It was interesting, or we had interesting discussions in this workshop, including in the Network Nature semester process, and well, some of the things that were already present in the materials that were developed were subject of discussion and kind of confirmed a little bit the what was already there. Identifying or proposing how standards could support the implementation of nature-based solutions from different for different type of stakeholders, being important how easing in the communication between different group of stakeholders with different jargons or interpretations could be supported by the existence of standards. Monitoring and impact assessment as one of the priorities, because as a matter of fact, having standard approaches to monitoring and impact assessment, the investment and the return of investment of nature-based solutions could be easily addressed, and therefore, in a broad sense, generating confidence among these stakeholders about the implementation of nature-based solutions. But at the same time, mentioning how too rigid standards or bringing standardization too far, it could be a constraint, avoiding place-based approaches, which was understood as a success criteria or success factor for nature-based solutions.
You have 1 minute left.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm about to finish. Well, these different type of approaches or different type of elements which could be subject of a standardization, monitoring, investment, that also process related or planning related standards were on the table, and well, highlighting also the importance of capacity building. What I have here is well, framework questions, to say it somehow, about if standards could be a tool for market development. I'm sorry, because there is a misspelling there. Contributing to procurement procedures, if standards could allow benchmarking and comparability of nature-based solutions benefit if it could be facilitating communication and understanding among different stakeholders and in a broad sense, helping scaling up an uptake of nature-based solutions. For information, there is already work going on in the framework of CLEVER, but also in the framework of SEN TC467 of sustainable cities, with a specific working group being kicked off now for defining a standardization roadmap, starting by nature-based solutions terminology standard, and well, with that eye on potential engagement and dissemination activities. And that would be all from my side.
Thank you also for bringing up this very important topic, and I think it could be definitely a big push for mainstreaming nature-based solutions. And this brings us to the panel discussion, and I would like to invite all my panelists, McKenna, Diana, Stefan, and Efren. So Efren, you can just stay here. Please come to the stage. And as time is short, and as we would like to have a vivid discussion and several questions, I would like to ask you always to keep short when talking. And I know we are now sitting in a virtual room. I would like you to imagine that we're sitting together in one living room. We are really comfy, maybe a bottle of beers like around us, or wine, whatever you prefer. And just see it as a conversation between you four. So I only have 2 questions, but I took the biggest question I could find. Sorry, for doing that, but it's a really interesting topic. So first question, I think, and we keep that short. So I throw it here, and then please start with a nice conversation. We're just watching you. The first question is, well, mainstreaming is a big term, and then often it's super fussy and conversations and papers, and we've never clarified it. So first question, just to start with, how do you define this term in your work environment, and what does it entail in terms of nature-based solutions? So you don't have to raise hands, but maybe make yourself visible. I don't know, who starts? Then I hand over to McKenna, because just go ahead.
No, that's good. Then I get the first fresh ideas, and everybody else has to think what I didn't say. So that's good. Yeah, no, I think mainstreaming, it's really a challenging concept, because there's a lot of discussion about, does it mean basically putting nature-based solutions everywhere? Does it mean watering down the concept and maybe checking boxes and just having nature-based solutions appear across all of these policy instruments, for example? Or what does it actually mean in practice? And for me, it's more about keeping the integrity of the term, making it into in a way, a household concept, but without losing the validity and the value of that approach. So it's really about making sure that we think of things like biodiversity, that we think of things like the multiple benefits, that we don't calling monocultures, for example, nature-based solutions, and just checking a box that's then integrated into these policy instruments. So I think making it more approachable and more accessible and more put on the same level as these traditional gray infrastructure approaches, or at least considered in the hybrid context, especially in an urban area. But yeah, not watering it down by mainstreaming it.
I can just agree if I would like to jump in. I can just agree. I think if you look at, I'm particularly concerned with, with the administrative side of planning, and so public authorities. And I think there's this well-known and huge challenge that there is often a very big sectoral division. The world is divided up into planning, into environment, into mobility, into housing, into economy, into social issues, etc. And if we want to make real progress with nature-based solutions or green infrastructure, then there is a big need to get out of the box of the environmental department, for instance, but to make sure that the concerns of nature-based solutions are also integrated into sectoral policies. And that is not necessarily a watering down, but it's really that they simply recognize that this needs to be there, and it needs to be there right from the start of making policies and not as an afterthought. So it's my hope that by mainstreaming, we will get away from a stepwise planning approach where nature-based solutions or green infrastructure are coming at step number 5.
Yeah, I was thinking that we need to co-create like new narratives surrounding the terms, and to be more simple for the people, and to have like be adaptive always, and understanding all the process in an integral way, but of course always in a co-development with the communities.
Yes, well, it's curious because since 30 years ago, we are talking about mainstreaming, integration, holistic approaches, with all the challenges related to sustainability and in a broad sense, and these are so. In addition to the new interpretation of the socio-ecological global challenges that we address, we keep talking about enablers like governance, mainstreaming, integration, and these are things that we've been talking about for 30 years. Having said this, well, mainstreaming for me should include also a prioritization approach. So priority for green is given in many policies and in all those sectoral policies that we are talking about. So the concept of priority for me is important to be put it up front when talking about mainstreaming. The second comment would be related to integration. And I don't know if we should talk about integration with better than integration into. And because that integrated approach implies that talking about nature-based solutions is talking about better climate policies and better climate change adaptation, or better inclusive regeneration. So is not, or I would say, is not trying to sneak in nature-based solutions into sectoral policies, is developing those policies in a holistic approach, and taking into account that working with nature-based solutions will make those policies more effective.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Can I just add to
Yeah,
that?
of course,
one?
go ahead. Go ahead.
I think I'm just imagining sitting in a room on a couch now. It's nice with his colleagues. So, just to add to that, I mean, I think definitely that's kind of the point for me as well. I think it's really amazing efforts, for example, what the Commission's doing with these urban greening plans. But I think it's also important in light of these urban greening plans and these dedicated strategies to not perpetuate the silos. So to make sure, for example, when we have these urban greening plans, that they're integrated within the whole policy landscape, and they're integrated within the different departments, and they're integrating the decision makers and the planners and the experts across those departments, rather than becoming a standalone instrument, which obviously has incredible value for these green areas within an urban context, but only insofar that it really takes into account the other priorities, competing priorities, the other values of the different actors involved in that landscape. So just adding on to what Efren said, I totally agree.
That is great. And I think you already touched upon the second question, and there are only 2 questions plus a very short final question, because it's like you said, Efren, okay, we're talking about mainstreaming sustainability for more than 30 years. When we are thinking about when we started with green and blue infrastructure, it started more than 10 years ago, and now it's nature-based solutions. And we're always wondering, how is it going to happen finally? Is it going to happen any day or never? So, and I would like also to reflect from your different regions, because maybe also Diana has another perspective on that. So my question is, so what have we achieved in this time, in the last 15 years? Where have we failed? And what are the challenges ahead? and still try to keep it short, but also like comment on your colleagues if you don't agree, if you have a different opinion. Keep drinking your wine and beer, and yeah, go ahead, please.
A bit early for the beer, but well. I think that things and talking about those origins of sustainability and or enhancement of nature of green infrastructure, green and blue infrastructure, etc. Things have changed a lot, and I think that the mindset of the practitioners at local and regional level and the state of the art is changing substantially. So we can somehow feel satisfied. The question is it doing it as fast and quick as the global challenges we are facing require? And for me, that is the complete, the main challenge, to say it somehow.
May I? My experience, so that's a little bit outside of CONEXUS, but that's more my experience with working with a big German city, is that at the level of administrative staff, if I look at the public administration, they are already collaborating quite often quite well at that level. The planners are working with the environmental department, etc. However, I think this is not enough. In particular, as Efren said, we want to make the changes quickly. What I really find very important is that we work on that at the top level, the politicians, the mayor and the elected councillors, etc., across the parties, come to a consensus that nature-based solutions and climate change adaptation and all the benefits that we need now are really embraced, and because if there is not a top-level change, then it's very hard for the administration underneath that to really stick to this. And the other thing that I also think is just as a difficult wheel to turn is that there is an incredible amount of regulations that make cooperative approaches very difficult. Mobility is working under its own regulations. The streets have a certain dimension, have to follow certain rules. The technical infrastructures have to follow certain rules. And all of these rules are often have been conceived at times when the world was different. And now we have to adapt to climate change and face other challenges. And we need to make it possible that collaboration can happen, really, and that we come up with integrative solutions. So these are two of the things that I have in mind.
I think in Latin America, it has been changed a lot. Now it's more hear the citizens' voice and recognize the initiatives of the people, but still are like not made it so visible. We need to make visible the invisible. And I think one of the main challenges or the most difficult has been to the times, no? One are the times of the institutions, the others from the academics, and the other the times of the city or the real streets, movements. So always these times are not going in the same way. And of course, the political priorities always change, and it's very difficult. For example, here in Bogota, that we have the hills, that is our patrimony, our natural and cultural patrimony, and we have been 15 years, and still they forget what they have done, and they began to study it again and again. And we need to be there, remembering what were, and to have there a shared vision, because there are many institutions and they don't have a shared visions of this huge and important ecological patrimony. So it's difficult, because I think the initiatives and the citizen initiatives are doing what we have thought and dream about what could be the future of this space. But the institution times, and of course the academics, are all in a different sphere. So we need to like integrate or conciliate that times.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what's been said, especially the last comment about an increase in the value or the recognition of the value of public participation. So I mentioned in my presentation about the shift from government to governance, and I think that's kind of one of the main, let's say, progress steps that we've made. Before I understand what Stefan is saying, that we're still fighting these kind of institutional restrictions. We also have short policy cycles. We also have the, let's say, challenge of having long-term visions when politicians are interested in their short-term votes and trying to accomplish what they've set out to do in order to get their budget for the next political cycle. So I think all of those are kind of very real challenges that we still face. At the same time, I think one of the old challenges, at least when we started working on this, maybe over 10 years ago on the topic of green infrastructure, was the lack of evidence. This was always the kind of excuse that was used, is there's a lack of numbers, there's a lack of ability to compare green and gray or hybrid and gray. There's a lack of centralization or integration of these different methodologies together to have a kind of compilation of evidence out there. And I think that's definitely shifted. I think now we have lots of evidence. We have really centralized efforts now to put this together in the same place. Methodologies are different. They have to be adapted to the local's context. That's clear. But I think that they're available now. I think the evidence is there. I think now it's a question, the guidelines are also there, I would say, like what Stefan was talking about before. There's a wealth of resources and information out there. It's a matter of translating this into action now. And that's where I think there's more momentum that's a little bit needed.
Yeah. And also just, I think there are many challenges. And I think also like this political instability is, I think it's a even higher challenge in Latin America than it's in Europe, whereas it's not changing the entire stuff when you have a new mayor coming. But at least for Bogota, I think at the moment there's big hope with Claudia Lopez, who's, or at least it seems she's very like making a lot of effort when it comes to sustainability. And I hope a lot will be created in her time when she has the powers. And speaking about powers, that brings me to my final question. So think about it. If you had superpowers for one day, what one thing would you do to foster nature-based solutions governance and mainstreaming? You can do whatever you want, no limits. What would it be? Who goes first? Stefan. If nobody comes, it's like in school. I just call you up.
So, maybe it's good to start with a stupid answer or so, but it's really, I mean, this is so difficult. What would I start first with? And whatever I'm going to say is wrong. What I sometimes dream of, and that is very much related to what I said before, so this is more the kind of top-down perspective I know very well, is I would like to bring together all the lawyers from the different departments and put them at one table and say, you don't leave this. I know that all your laws speak against integrated solutions, but at the end of the day, you go out of this room and say, yes, we can do it all the same. And we all stretch our laws to the possible extent, and then we know that we can come up with integrated solutions. But that's of course wishful thinking.
I like it, but we need those visions. So perfect, thank you. Who's going next? McKenna.
I can go. Yeah, I think it's similar. It has nothing to do with reality, but you said that's the idea. I think if I could do one thing, it would be just to put time on hold. I think the main thing is that everybody's restricted by like a to-do list, by budgets, by the pressure that they're under to deliver on a daily basis without having room to actually breathe, to think, to consider, to process, to discuss, to confer with different experts, different members of society. So I think that's what I would like to do, is like just stop time for a day and say, you have time, you don't have to worry about any of your normal day-to-day things, and you just have the ability to actually invest in conversation, invest in dialogue, and move forward with these discussions.
Cool, I like it. Diana.
I will invite like 1 month travesy. I don't know if it's good said, travesía. And then I will invite all the academics, the people from the street, the people from the institution in a walk for the mountains, and we will stop in each one of neighborhoods and discuss with each of the communities, and take like at the end of the 53 kilometers walk in that month, we will share a vision of and conclusions of what we have seen and walk in the territories.
That sounds very doable to me. So I think that's a good plan, Diana. Evelyn, you're the last one. And then before we're concluding, go ahead.
No, I was trying to find something which has created substantial change in our daily life in the last years, and what has happened in order to make that possible, and try to think about how making the parallelism with nature-based solutions and greener cities. And well, smoking in public spaces or smoking in bars and public transport was something quite normal just a few years ago, and that suddenly changed. And I think that if I could have that power to change something suddenly, would be taking us to the tipping point where greener cities is an unavoidable trend, like stopping smoking in public spaces. What is that tipping point? I don't know.
You don't have to answer all the questions, but many, many thanks. I liked it. And yeah, the next time we do it in real. I would really like
with
to
the beer.
Yeah, whatever you like. It can be also like an apple juice, whatever you like best. But yeah, thanks all for the really good talks. Also Natalia for doing the interview. And yes, and we are at a point where we have unfortunately to close the session, but I saw there are some questions for you in the Q&A. And if you have some time, please have a look at it. Now we will break, and I don't know, Tom, when will we be back? Because you will be the next. So please enlighten us.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for keeping almost the time, 2 minutes, and wonderful speeches and interventions. Thank you. So yeah, back on 50 minutes. So in other words, 18 minutes from now. Here that's 15:50, but I think in many parts of Europe it's 16:50. So yeah, if you can rejoin us, please. We want to see the numbers raising rather than lowering, and we have some great speeches. So thank you very much. In the meantime, enjoy a coffee or a tea, or even just stand up and wiggle around. Thank you very much. slides short.
We have 2 more minutes, Tom, I guess, till we start.
Super. What I'll do is I'll just put my the overview of the session up just briefly, and then we'll be ready. Super. So that's worked.
Tom, can you please share your screen in presentation mode? Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Rick. Well, I think like always at these kind of sessions, you watch the numbers, and towards the end of the day, it's a little bit like watching the British pound fluctuating on the market, and then it seems to have stabilized. So, yeah, I think well, we're down to the hardcore in some respects, and you know, we're the movers and shakers, picking up on the discussion just before the session. And to quote O'Shaughnessy, we're the music makers and the dreamers of the dreams. And in the forthcoming session, I really hope we will light up the room with some exciting ideas, but also some urgent challenges for nature-based solutions and some solutions. So yeah, I'll briefly introduce the speakers shortly, but I'd like to kick us off with just a few words of introduction first, if that's okay. So urban and suburban nature-based solutions present a fascinating set of opportunities, challenges, and options. And some key issues here include how to strengthen social cohesion and engagement in NBS. And care in the way that we handle relationships and contexts is critical, as well as our understanding of the impacts, including successes and the downsides too. So the complexity of urban land fragmentation, ownership and habitats, and the community development histories all add vital nuances. In this respect, urban nature-based solutions differ greatly from rural and even peri-urban ecosystem restoration, and the chances for funding in particular differ greatly, especially for management and maintenance. So many policies and authorities now call for greater justice and inclusivity, but as our 2020 State of the Art report for the EC noted, co-creation doesn't always mean inclusion. To quote Harriet Bulkley, we need to engage in the specifics. So for instance, here in Sheffield, an old industrial city, we have high levels of brownfield land, unique communities, and distinct socio-economic drivers that entirely differ from those in agricultural places or capital cities. So this session seeks to highlight, drawing on Latin American, Chinese, and European contexts, some of the implications, and how can we highlight together the good practices to better mobilize social processes within this myriad of complex, evolving, and exciting environments. We have lots of questions, but also emerging findings and good responses to hear about today. So we'll be hearing from Johannes Langemeyer about justice in ecosystem services, then from Ian Buis on participatory assessment, then from Erica Calderon about nature-based solutions in density-deprived neighbourhoods, and then from Manuel Wolf on multiple perspectives on accessibility of urban forests. So we'll have 10 minutes each per speaker, and again, I'll give a 2-minute notice verbally. Participants, please do use the Q&A function so that we can inform the panel discussion with points raised. And then at the very end, I'll give a very brief intro to tomorrow's proceedings and some closing remarks. And undertaking to try to finish by 6 o'clock here, 5 o'clock here, 6 o'clock in Europe, and various times all around the world. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Johannes. I will stop sharing. And Johannes is a human geographer with an interdisciplinary background in environmental and sustainability sciences, based at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, ICTA, in Barcelona's Autonomous University. His work fosters social science approaches in ecosystem service research, and specifically develops novel approaches in theory and in practice advancing ecosystem service justice and participatory approaches. Johannes, looking forward to it.
We can hear you. Please turn.
You're muted, Johannes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thanks. So thank you for that introduction. I'm speaking to you from the island of Crete, where I'm participating in the Ecosystem Service Partnership Conference, and where these topics of justice and equity in ecosystem service work, and particularly also in urban ecosystem service work, are on the agenda as well. So it really aligns very well to speak in this webinar and to have the chance to speak in this webinar. Excuse me here that this presentation will be a little bit more theoretical. I make it as practical as possible with some examples, but I think to pave the ground here, we'll set the scene a little bit more theoretical approach. The shape of future cities is what we are defining now. And I think it's very important to always think about this again, that what we are doing now in our cities will determine the quality of life in cities in the next 50, 80, 100 years from now, given the technical lock-ins that we are facing. And I'm always bringing here the example of the sewage system, and looking at Tom here, with whom we have a project on that together, where we are facing technical lock-ins that are 100 years old. So let's keep this always in mind. Ecosystem services have become an important approach in urban planning, but still we see that equity and justice are not part of the equation. So we see that they remain marginal in urban nature-based solutions planning and in ecosystem service assessments. An anecdote here, we again got the smallest room for doing our sessions on equity here in the ESP conference. Well, if we neglect inequalities or justice in nature-based solutions planning, we might see results like this one. And this is a picture from Shenzhen, or pictures from Shenzhen. That was the first conference where I started to talk about equity and justice in ecosystem services. And this was the building I was living in. And you see here that on the left-hand side, the nice urban park on the bottom of that building. In the center, you see that a little bit better. And then on the right-hand side, you see the same building, and you notice that the park here is in the second floor of that building. So only accessible for those people who are wealthy enough to live in this building, and not accessible for anybody else. The ecosystem service approach has shown to be really useful for the assessment and monitoring of nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, and so on and so forth, not only, but also in cities. But we see that the ecosystem service research community has been widely homogeneous to the adaptation of justice and equity in it. So this is variables that only recently have entered this debate. And it's important to foster that further, I assume. So with colleagues within the ESP community, but also with colleagues from the Barcelona Urban Environmental Justice Lab, and here primarily James Connolly, who's now an associate professor at University of British Columbia, we have started to develop an empirical model to really incorporate justice notions in the ecosystem service assessments. And this is the overarching model that we developed. Don't get scared away from this. I will walk you through in the details of this step by step. So what we argue here is, and we have heard talks before about co-creation and participatory processes. We argue here that participation is not all. And when we look at procedures here in the upper part, the institution and the governance of and decision making around nature-based solutions, it's as important as to have a good participatory process to look at the framing. And we must acknowledge here that terms like nature-based solutions, ecosystem restoration, green infrastructure planning, also ecosystem services, these are not neutral terms per se. These ontologies are excluding people. So I am, for example, self-excluding myself normally when the discussion comes to smart cities. This is something that we really need to take into account, that the framing already sets the scene for being more inclusive or less inclusive. And this is not only the ontology or the terminology, the concepts that we work with, but that is also what are the boundaries of the concrete planning situation that we are in, and the power relations that are behind that, which is the margin that we have for decision making. From here we move to participation, and I'm not going any deeper into this. So we have these are the principles that we are using in the INTERLACE project, and we will discuss participation more over later on. But I argue here that taking this broader picture into account, we might shift a little bit the emphasis on the participatory processes, even though they are very important as well. What I would like the next step to be here in the model is to focus on on the distribution of benefits. For a long time, we only have looked at the availability of green spaces in cities, and this changes now, and we are looking to the accessibility of cities. This is an example from a student of mine in the city of Rome, where we see like a very homogeneous distribution of green spaces across the city. So the availability is given for all, but we see that we do here a study of the accessibility, and here different abilities of people come into play. So here we have a 300-meter radius, which we assume for elderly people and young children, this is a good walking distance. And here we see this is the accessibility for people that are very fit and have a kilometer reach in this. So the ability is determining the accessibility, as are the green space availability and the built infrastructure. In addition to that, the ecosystem service concept allows us to look deeper into the quality of those green spaces. And here we have an example of two municipalities. On the left-hand side, one rich municipality, the 8th municipality in Rome. On the right-hand side, a poorer. And we see that the park quality is very different. So even though they have the same availability in both areas or similar availabilities, the access to particular ecosystem services is very limited in this 6th municipality, primarily reduced to physical recreational activities. And that leads us to the next bubble, and that is the perceptions of values and needs and preferences. This is an example from a study in Barcelona we did, where for the city of Barcelona, we asked the expert panel to determine what are the needs for ecosystem services to be produced. And we see here that there's different preferences behind that. We see that the preferences are strongly determined by the different social groups. I'm showing this example here from a park in Barcelona as well. And this is the behavior or the preferences by female and male users. And we see that they are very different. The blue dots are the female users that stay in the outskirts of that park, while the male users use the entirety of the park. So this is very important to take that into account, the different preferences that different social groups have. And we need to particularly focus on the marginalized groups in this context, being aware that marginalization is multi-layered and very context dependent.
2 minutes, Jonas.
Perfect. What we also need to take into account is when thinking about the values is the different epistemologies. So how we value and how we express value is relevant here. And just to give you one example, the emotional ties with nature, we cannot represent very well in monetary terms. So we need to be very sensitive to how we how we express and make people express their values and preferences in order to capture them broadly. And here the ecosystem service literature and not least the IPIS value assessment has worked on that very strongly in the last years and focuses on this plurality of values. And this links us also back to different framings and different ontologies. To make it even more complex, we had a spatial dimension to this. So all the relationships that I have just outlined have also a spatial component, and they're influenced by the upper scale and lower scale relationships. Just to give you one example, this is a evaluation exercise again from Barcelona, where we asked the same people to focus on 3 different scales, on the city scale, the metropolitan scale, and the regional scale, to answer what are the ecosystem services that are most important at each of these scales. And you see here, just to pick one, the food provision that we see is highly important at the regional scale. It loses all its importance when we look at the municipal scale of the city of Barcelona. Same people answering these questions from a different perspective, answering completely different. What we also need to take into account in the spatial relations is what Cito has called the teleconnections. So we might establish a very just system in our cities, while we might externalize injustices to other parts of the world. Just think about import of food, for example.
Can I ask you to draw to a close to keep time for questions and discussion, Johannes, please?
I need 30 more seconds. So finally, we have the temporal dimension, and we see here a vulnerability map of that we developed in the INTERLACE project in the city of Krakow. And here the temporal dimension in the past helps us or requires us to ask what did produce current inequalities in vulnerability. Future considerations might take into account that our green interventions might not only have positive effects for all. And this is a study by my colleague Isabel Angolovsky on the green gentrification in the surroundings of urban parks. To conclude, just nature-based solution planning is beyond societal participation. And I consider as core here that we think more explicitly about inclusive framing plus participation, that we look at the inequalities in availability, capabilities, and accessibility to different types of benefits, that we recognize different needs and wants and epistemologies, and that we focus on spatial, context dependencies, and teleconnections. And finally, that we take into account past inequalities and future impacts of the nature-based solutions that we are building. Thank you.
Wonderful. Many thanks indeed, Johannes. We'll move promptly on to Arjen Buis. If you can share your screen, your presentation, Arjen. So Arjen is a senior scientist at the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group in Wageningen University. His work focuses on community engagement in urban transformations with explicit interests in mainstreaming nature-based solutions, environmental justice, and plural valuation. Many thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Sorry, thank you, Tom, for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I think I kind of follow up on some of the work Johannes has been doing, but now focusing on monitoring and assessment. So if you look from within the CONEXUS project, we are focusing also, of course, on these justice aspects, and in our work package we especially focus here on monitoring and assessment, and also trying to make this more inclusive. So this monitoring and assessment approaches we are using in CONEXUS, we kind of aim for three important elements of monitoring and assessment. First of all, I think all of us know this, that this monitoring is really important to try to improve the uptake and mainstreaming of nature-based solutions. For example, understanding the impacts is key here, understanding what nature-based solutions can contribute to all the challenges we have in our cities. But it's also important to understand the process. So what barriers and what challenges and what opportunities do exist at the municipal level, at the national level, or at the local level. For this in CONEXUS, we also try to improve some of the governance indicators that are already out there. A second aim for this framework is also to contribute to environmental justice, for example, by using some of the justice indicators that has been developed previously. And also here we try to make some small improvements. But I think the most important focus for the assessment framework we have been developing in CONEXUS is trying to make this assessment really inclusive. Actually, we sometimes talk about making it radically inclusive, because we feel if you really want to use assessment and monitoring to contribute to transformative change and also to a just transformation, also the monitoring process needs to be just and inclusive. So therefore we developed this participatory assessment framework, on which I will tell a little bit more in this presentation. And of course, co-creation is quite key here, but also some of the other aspects. Within the CONEXUS project, one way to aim for inclusive nature-based solutions is through the concept of nature-based thinking, as this has developed by Thomas Randrup and others. And one argument why we have been developing this approach is because over the last couple of years, and I think many of us know this, there have been raised some questions and remarks about inclusiveness of nature-based solutions and the justice aspects. Do they maybe sometimes reinforce inequalities? Do they contribute to gentrification? Some argue that they may reinforce neoliberal ideologies, and also some reports have been published that while they may contribute to small-scale adaptation or mitigation, a lack of true transformation that may be needed may be an issue with nature-based solutions. Next to this, also the implementation and mainstreaming remains a challenge for nature-based solutions. And this is one of the reasons why this nature-based thinking has been developed, and we are using this in the CONEXUS project. And here on the right, you see a graphical representation from the paper from Randrup et al., where you see that in this nature-based thinking, it is really about the connections between the ecological part, the connections between with the community, the connection between community and government, and the connections between the governments and the ecological elements of nature-based solutions. Interestingly, we can link this to environmental justice. And I had already expected that Johannes Langemeyer would also show this very nice figure from his work. So I thought, well, we could easily link to this, because if you look at this, these three dimensions of environmental justice, the procedural, distributional, recognition justice, this can quite easily be linked to the ideas of nature-based thinking. And of course, this is not a coincidence. For example, if you look at these procedural justice, this is really about this connection between community and governance. So how are the procedures, how community is engaging with governments, but also how are governments engaging with actions from civil society. If you look at the distribution, of course, that is where the governments have an important role to play in how these ecological and the ecological benefits are distributed across society. And finally, on the left, for the recognition justice, this really relates also to this plurality of values and knowledge systems in communities where also Johannes Langemeyer talked a little bit about. So that's also one of the reasons why we think this nature-based thinking may be helpful to use when you develop a participatory assessment framework to contribute to just transformations. And our main argument here is that, of course, it's important and it's crucial to look at procedure. It's crucial to look at the distribution. It's crucial to look at recognition. But it's also crucial to make this monitoring and assessment approach more inclusive and make sure that voices are heard throughout this process. And that's where this participatory assessment framework comes from. I will skip this one. And if you're working with participatory assessment, literature argues, for example, work by Esther Turnhout and others argues there are two really important elements for participatory assessment. One of them is that you really need to have a contextualized assessment approach. It needs to be place-based, really relevant to the places where it's used. It's also important that it has continuity, so it needs to have the capacity to measure also in the long term, not only during the project, but also after the project ends. Then local stakeholders need to be able, but also inclined to continue monitoring and to continue to learn from this monitoring. And finally, it's very important that all indicators that may be relevant to the different stakeholders and different communities are included. And only then, if these assessment approaches are really contextualized, then you can develop locally relevant data that may indeed contribute to nature-based solutions, to the implementation, and especially also to the justice aspects of nature-based solutions. Next to this contextualized assessment approach, also the politicized co-production effort is really important. So assessment is always political. The choice of indicators has implications for what is measured, but also for the narratives that are developed around nature-based solutions. So that's why we argue also for this politicized efforts. For example, be sensitive to the plural values and the different communities that are for which nature-based solutions may be relevant. But also try to expose specific vulnerabilities of marginalized groups. Sometimes if you use averages, these specific vulnerabilities may drop out. So it's really important to also expose these vulnerabilities and discuss them for the consequences. And finally, it's really important to be sensitive to power differences. And I really even engage with these power differences through dialogue in the assessment process. If this process is politicized, then we think and hope that it can indeed contribute to empowered stakeholders. So these are the kind of feedback loops here in the figure. And in the end, of course, it needs to contribute to nature-based solutions, contributing to sustainable and just cities. So what's really important here are two things. The process really needs to be participatory, but also the content. So first, if you look at the process, I think these 4 steps are quite typical for a monitoring process. So you need to define goals, you need to select indicators, you need to collect data, and you need to analyze and evaluate. And our argument is that all these 4 steps really need to be inclusive. And what we do in CONEXUS, and also I think another project this has been done, you start, of course, with identifying the key stakeholders. And in CONEXUS, we also organize workshops, for example, Nature Future workshops, to identify these objectives and challenges. From here,
if it's okay.
2 minutes. Yeah, okay. From here, we select, we suggest indicators from the CONEXUS portfolio, but also place-based indicators are added here. And what's really important in these processes, first of all, especially these first 2 steps, they need to be politicized and contextualized. These 2 steps also need to be co-produced, for example, for continuity. And the inclusiveness of these 4 steps is especially important in defining the goals, in the participatory indicator selection, but also in the analysis and evaluation. So that was on the process. Secondly, also the content is really important. And here, this selection of indicators is really crucial. And we argue that for the selection of indicators, there are 4 main criteria. That's credibility, salience, legitimacy, and feasibility. And interestingly, there's a trade-off between these different criteria. And we argue that in discussing the indicators and which indicators should be measured, it's very relevant to look at what has been called a continuum of evidence. You can have very strong scientifically based indicators that will have credibility, but the salience may not be too big for local communities or the feasibility to measure them. On the other hand, you can have very place-based, quick and resource-light indicators on which the scientific credibility may not be optimal. So discussing indicators on this continuum of evidence can contribute to selecting the indicators that are really fit for purpose for your assessment framework. So concluding, this is a difficult process, of course, and I think we all know this. If you want to contribute to nature-based solutions implementations, through assessment and monitoring, we argue that it's really important to do this participatory. We argue that they need to be politicized and contextualized for an inclusive process, and this may contribute to trust and collaborations. Of course, trust and collaboration are already important in the start of the process, but during the process, they may enhance, and if so, then the process can contribute to relevant and legitimate outcomes, which in the end contribute to impact and mainstreaming. And actually, that's exactly what we are doing in the CONEXUS project. So we have this participatory assessment framework developed over the last 1.5 years. And now we are using this in the different live labs where the indicators are being selected. Some have already been selected in live labs and it's being measured. From this, we have learning cycles in each live lab to learn from also the outcomes of these indicators. And in the end, it feeds into the ecosystem of guidelines on which Stefan Paulight has been telling a little bit, I think, in the previous workshop. That's it for me. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Arjen. So next, and hopefully you can share your presentation as well, Erica. And I will give a short introduction. So Erica Calderon is a lawyer in the General Management Department of the National Institute of Housing and Urbanism in San Jose, Costa Rica. Erica is also the president of the Corredor Biológico Interurbano Rio Maria Aguila. And today she'll talk about social inclusion and environmental justice. Erica, the floor is yours.
Gracias. ¿Tengo que compartir yo la presentación?
Sí,
Ok, un segundo. Muy bien, ahí se ve la presentación.
Sí, perfecto.
Yes.
Ok, gracias. Bueno, buenas tardes, buenos días. Para mí es un placer.
For me, it's a pleasure to have been invited to share a few words with all of you today. As was mentioned, I'm going to speak about the implementation of nature-based solutions in places and neighborhoods that are semi-populated and some marginal neighborhoods, and how this can be an actual tool to improve environmental justice and the creation of social cohesion. I'm also going to speak about citizen participation throughout these processes and the methodology that we use. So we start with an idea about nature-based solutions, that basically what we want to do is to harness nature and the potential that healthy ecosystems have in order to provide benefits to people, but also to create a better environment and to safeguard biodiversity. And with this, we're going to basically have nature-based solutions. We're going to have an opportunity here to be able to try or to be able to change these neighborhoods. And this is also a very effective and adaptive way to face certain challenges that we have as a society, not only as individuals or neighborhood groups, but as a society. And we have these common challenges, and we need to face them concretely together by working with these types of neighborhoods. What are the challenges we want to face in neighborhoods? Basically, climate change, reducing the possibility of natural disasters, the loss of biodiversity, and obviously human health. All of this in order to work on the need or trying to find sustainable economic development, not only for the people that live in these locations, but for society in general. And in the case of Costa Rica, we started with 3 basic ideas. The projects that I'm going to present up next count on these 3 concepts, these 3 notions, these ideas. The first is surrounding cities and neighborhoods, understanding that in these locations, this is where the people live. We are not going to remove people from their neighborhoods, take them out or remove them from the cities in order to do ecological restoration or to recover ecosystems. Nonetheless, we do have a super important need to work on recovering nature in these spaces at the same time. So we have to try to juggle this concept. And also in the case of Costa Rica, according to the forestry laws, rivers and other water bodies, according to the law, are protected by an area that we have to safeguard, that we have to not construct on, where the water areas are located by law. In some cases 10, in some cases 50, or sometimes even more meters, depending on the location. But this area in principle will allow us to have a buffer area and the municipality also has to have important vegetation covers, and that will prevent natural disasters and will provide biodiversity some safety nets. And also related to public parks, because public parks are state-run parks or public, or mainly they belong to the municipality. And this allows us to ensure that despite the passing of time, nature will always be permitted in these public parks. So it will always be very difficult for something that today is a public park in a few years or in some decades will be lost. So they would have to go through a very difficult and complicated process in legislative assembly in order to privatize, and they would have to demonstrate where there's a need. If they affect a public park, they have to have a better condition in order for society to replace it. You need a replacement or compensation or an offset. So there's really no cases where they're losing these public parks. So as I told you before, the 2 cases that I'm going to talk about today are related to urban interventions. The first is the CBIMA project in the district of San Jose in Atillo. It's important because in the country and today, this is a project that was done about 1956. It's true that it started a while back, but this is the most ambitious project that we've had in order to provide solutions for people. More than 50,000 people went through 8 phases of this project, and it's also localized in the middle of the Maria Aguilar and Rio TDV. So there's 2 water bodies that are very important that flow right through this project or that border the project. The other project that I'm going to speak about is the one that we are implementing in La Sabanita. La Sabanita is called La Sabanita because it's considered a savanna, and it's a smaller savanna. Sabanita is a smaller savanna, and it's in Guapil, in San Felipe, in Alajuelita, which is the 5th canton, most populated canton, where we have the most population density in the capital of San Jose. And more than 89,000 people live in what we call a canton, and the geography is mainly a mountainous terrain. So I'm going to speak about the project, CBIMA Star project, flagship project. This is the project before it began. This was the problematic that we had. We had strong squatting presence of flowers, but also infrastructure. We had a problem related to homeless people we continue to face, especially all the people that are in the streets. And we had also a huge problem that we've overcome quite a lot about solid waste management. And as you see in this image here, in the lower right side, the place did not have a sidewalk. And this was a problem that did not have. This was a problem not only due to people's mobility, but also because this wall that you see here was a kindergarten or a public school. And approximately 90% of the children that actually go to this educational school live very close by in an informal settlement or a squatting area, and they had to cross this road without a sidewalk, without a pavement, and they risked dangerous transit so they can arrive to their school. And that's what the place looked like in the past. Well, these are a few of the images of what was done. The first thing that was done was to create a permeable sidewalk or pavement. Remember, the material that was used was more friendly. It was actually allowed to drain the water. And this is a retaining wall or contention wall. This was the before and after. And we tried to stabilize the hillside. This is an image this week. We can see that the change is quite radical. We continue to do work here, but we can already see and we can appreciate this. We've gone through a very strong rainy season, and we see how nature-based solutions that have been implemented are actually bearing fruit and are benefiting us. Basically, we worked with those 4 points. The first, we actually did an internal walkway through different state properties, and also the sidewalk with porous concrete that can be filtered, water can filter through it. And we did infiltration drain that collects rainwater as well. And this also uses granular material that will allow us to have water filter or rainwater to actually go into the soil in a better fashion. We also planted native species. We did a lot of different workshops with the community, so the community themselves would take ownership of their spaces and to help plant the seeds. And we also planted the riverside. The second is the case of La Sabanita. Sabanita, as we said, is a densely populated and vulnerable area. Here we mostly find women that are heads of their household, mostly children and young people, but we also have many opportunities. We count on a local government which is very dynamic and committed and very active, really. The space that are being intervened belongs to municipality. It's a public park, which is 2.6 hectares. And we work hand in hand with the participation. We have a very organized community. This space that we see in red right here is the Sabanita intervention. Those are the 2.6 hectares where we're intervening. And here we want to build 2 observation decks, and we want to create a playground area as well, which is inclusive. We want to create a multi-purpose court with an athletic circuit and also some universal accessible paths. And here I'm going to show you some pictures this week where we already began the project and started to do the building of these routes or these paths. And as you can see, all the phases that we have had for this project that will continue always have the participation of the community and the municipality. In both projects, we've used the same methodology. What we're trying to do is having workshops with the community to determine what their needs are, what needs the site has. We work with an interdisciplinary group to have a pre-project, then we look for financing sources, and finally we implement this and execute this project, always with the participation of our citizens. This is what we want to do basically in order to have them take ownership of their public spaces, but we can also guarantee in this fashion that we are working and decreasing the gap of access to green areas in the city. So these types of projects in neighborhoods which are so densely populated with very vulnerable populations will guarantee that those people will truly have access to quality spaces that they deserve. And at the same time, we ensure that we will actually improve biodiversity. So that would be it for me, and I wanted to thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. That's wonderful. I think we'll move straight on to the next talk, and then we should have time for picking up some of the questions already in the chat and hopefully some more. Please do use the chat function, the Q&A. So next we have Manuel. So Manuel is a postdoctoral researcher at the Landscape Ecology Lab at the Humboldt University of Berlin. He's currently working in the Horizon 2020 Clearinghouse project, and his current work focuses on ecosystem services and their dynamics, as well as human environmental interactions and networks. So Manuel Wolf, I hope I pronounced the name correctly. I hope you can share your screen and speak. Okay.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm honored. Perfectly spelled. And yeah, thanks also to all who stayed with us until the end of the day. I will talk about different ways you can actually look at accessibility and how we in the project Clearinghouse seek to make sense out of it, and how to do that. Just a second. So now it should work. Okay. So how to do that? Basically, it's quite easy. I'm using the example of a park. The park is called Lene Vogt Park in Leipzig, Germany. A park which has been created on a former brownfield site. As an example, and kind of walk you through the different ideas within the next 10 minutes. Some of you might know that accessibility, if you look for a definition, is defined as a relative opportunity to reach and engage with a given resource. It could be an NBS itself or its benefits. If you read it a little bit further, then you realize that, hey, this definition already provides some strong links to the concept of social and environmental justice. And we heard a lot about this in the previous talks already. And this is the second important point here, it implies that there are obviously different forms of accessibility, at least spatial and aspatial. But starting with spatial forms of accessibility, you can see here our park example and a potential beneficiary at bottom left. So traditionally, what you do or what is done is you measure the amount of potential NBS accessible to people, for instance, a green space within a given walking distance, or vice versa. You measure the zone of influence of an NBS benefit if you think, for instance, on heat mitigation. What is striking instead for us in Clearinghouse is rather the connecting area between a beneficiary and the given NBS. So as others already said, so it's not just the pure availability nor the pure spatial accessibility of an NBS, but questions such as, do I need to take barriers into account when I seek to benefit from an NBS, from a nature-based solution? Do I have the capacity and the information to actually to navigate through all accessibility options? Taking all beneficiaries of, for instance, a neighborhood or a city into account, we can even then go further and estimate recreational flows of people together with their barriers and their exposure to, for instance, health stress. And how does the corresponding network look like in the surrounding of our park example? What you see here are the nodes of the network, so to say, which are represented by households. And they are, of course, exposed to certain sets of physical barriers, not only physical, but also certain sets of barriers. And this also needs to be contrasted with the individual capacities or health conditions of the people, of course. Secondly, within this network, the edges estimate recreational flows. And based on this, we can actually deduce a potential exposure of people to certain pollution or heat, for instance, before they can actually reach and benefit from a green space. Secondly, stating that justice not only matters humans, a second network mirrors ecological connectivity of urban species. So what you see here is some examples of like forest patches and particular trees, which can represent habitats or stepping stones relevant for establishing ecological links. And going back to the creation of our park example, you can see here that the forest patches which have been created provided some relevant, or currently provide some relevant stepping stones and alternative paths towards the well-connected areas in the northern and eastern part. And by doing so, also, of course, increases the interaction between humans and wildlife, or humans and animals. And this brings us to a third, let's say, network, because socio-ecological interactions in general give rise to questions if people actually perceive the state and change of NBS traits, and how do they evaluate this? So citizen science, so to speak. And the way this perception is captured, filtered, and distributed forms a third network consisting of citizens interested and engaged in the vitality, for instance, of an NBS. For our example in Leipzig, drought and heat are in particular challenging, as the soil and water conditions on a former brownfield are not ideal. We use an app, actually, which hosts the corresponding survey of tree traits, and which was then used by citizens for detecting tree stress, as you can see here, some examples. At other locations in cities and also in other, in Leipzig and also in other cities, this app was used in order to capture perceived barriers of people. So basically it can be adapted to any topic of interest. So how to make sense out, how to bring it together. I talked about three, let's say, network layers. And of course, one of those, or an individual network, might not be so super new. Clearinghouse is now interested in understanding the double or threefold role of nodes and edges as a product of the intersection of the three layers. So for instance, an NBS can be important as a node in various networks, while other nodes might form, for instance, trade-offs due to their role in different networks. If you, for instance, think about forest patches being relevant for the recreation and the habitat at the same time, what brings about a certain conflict potential, but in contrast are perceived for any reasons as a disturbing place. So Clearinghouse now seeks to understand the role of an NBS within networks, actually, and not just the three mentioned networks, but a bit more. And we started to actually survey this in our European case studies, but also bring this into to any interested city, and of course also to our Chinese counterparts. And in addition, we want to synthesize the different, let's say, types of knowledge which are implemented in this different networks, also enriched by understandable storylines within a web-based platform, the so-called Seek Hub. And this spatial information and knowledge hub will at least fulfill a threefold purpose. And here we are very welcome also additional opinions and exchange with other experts from other projects. So first, it provides knowledge and raises awareness for the subject, not only among experts, but also stakeholders, residents, neighborhoods, any type, and allowing for feedback, which will be visible on the web platform. We will kind of spin our own additional network, so to say, by connecting people and their individual knowledge, which can be very local, but can also be on a broader context. Second, of course, we want to push the governance button by raising awareness that the creation or elimination of individual NBS or green spaces have an effect not just in situ on the individual site, but also on other elements within the spatial and aspatial networks, in the same network or on other networks. And here we make use of, for instance, scenarios together with stakeholders and decision makers. And third, motivated by results and also the stakeholder interest in our cities, we will kind of take the chance to actually revisit established concepts such as multifunctionality and just try to rethink it against the different dimensions of accessibility and multiple networks. Okay, that's it from my side. Thanks for listening.
Wow, you just made my job a lot easier. Thank you very much, Manuel. It's just so wonderful to hear this diversity of different perspectives, but with very common shared passions and interests behind the topics. Thank you very much indeed. So we do have a significant, chunk of time, hopefully, a good few minutes for some discussions. I picked up on something from the chat for Erica around what's happening with the citizens who are living on the streets. We'll come on to that shortly. If everyone can turn their cameras on in the meantime.
Sí, estaba contestando. Sí,
okay.
claro.
Yes, of course. So basically the problem with the people living on the streets is that it's a very difficult situation. There are quite a few, and many of them have been taken to treatment and left that condition, but most of them are still there. So we've tried to really understand that people living on the streets are an additional actor on the site, and so we invite the community to perform reforestation tasks, and we also speak or work with the people living on the streets. We take food to them to understand that by improving this space, this environment, this will also benefit them.
Unas técnicas de urbanismo táctico.
We also have tactical urban development to avoid materials that are not going to be stolen. So we're creating a handrail, for example. People who visited Costa Rica in May last year saw that
Estamos sustituyéndola por bambú, pensando que
so that we had issues with this. Now we are using bamboo because we believe that this material will not be of interest for people who would like to steal the materials. So this would last over time, and we still have the people living there.
You can see that it's a very kind of caring and socially oriented model, and we see these kind of instances over and over again. I think often in more urban deprived neighborhoods. Interesting, difficult processes sometimes, but yeah, if we take care of gentrification issues, then I think then clearly mitigation is possible. Johannes also pointed towards some practical tools for supporting this from Barcelona. Johannes, did you want to just kind of reiterate that briefly? Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm not really the expert in green gentrification here, but there's my colleagues who have worked on that during the 5 years project. So I left some resources there in the question answer box that they produced. Yeah, I'm maybe for my own research a takeaway on that is being careful with aesthetics. That is when we did a follow-up study on what is causing the gentrification processes in Barcelona, we could see a clear relationship between aesthetic elements in those green spaces and the aesthetically pleasing design and those gentrification processes. This is, well, not a totally conclusive study, but it's at least an indication.
Yeah, super. And I think, yeah, I think this process happens at multiple scales, right? And referring back to the modernist planners in the 1920s, you saw citywide level kind of mass movements of people, and that kind of brings me on to the next kind of question, really, that I had, which was about the interplay between planning. And particularly bearing in mind this urban greening plans that's been launched today, between planning and engagement, and particularly the long-term management, long-term processes of nature-based solutions. I think Ian and Manuel, maybe your two talks sort of picked up on these themes slightly, but we could do a bit more maybe. So Ian?
So on the challenge for long-term placekeeping, that is, or the question was not fully clear to me. Sorry, Tom.
The relationships between the broader scale planning processes and these issues of engagement and empowerment or disempowerment of citizens in green issues broadly, maybe.
Yes, exactly. And I think key here is really this ownership issue, not so much the legal ownership, but especially the mental ownership of these areas. I think was really important if you want to have this long-term commitment to areas, and people not, well, using the areas for a long time, maybe also contributing to some of the maintenance, or at least not the destroying and neglecting the areas. I think this is really important, though, to give them some ownership and to make sure that the areas fit with their needs and, well, for example, also their aesthetic preferences, as Johannes already referred to.
Super. And Manuel, I'll kind of make a more targeted kind of question around this, which is this issue of access and disturbance of wildlife on the one hand, but human nature experience. Have you grappled with this in Clearing House?
Well, it also plays a role, of course. The app I was mentioning is kind of used for this purpose because it also allows people to actually engage within a given element, because it can be so, it is usually very target oriented. So there's a particular challenge which has been reported, and there's an interest by the stakeholder or by local residents to have a small tool, not an expert tool, but a small tool which they can continuously use in order to actually, let's say, monitor and assess what they see there. And this is how the way how we kind of facilitate. I would just want to come back to your previous question, because we also know examples where an NBS, or let's keep it a bit broader, a green space, the implementation of green space simply fails because it's not the willingness of the planning process itself, but the uncertainties in maintaining. Even though you get it from a grassroots initiative with a lot of participation, it's all fine. But as long as the long-term effect is not ensured, it will fail from the very beginning. And I was briefly mentioning also barriers. And usually what we look at is, well, speaking of barriers, is usually then we start looking for physical barriers. Which are relevant for residents. But at the same time, you can also look at barriers when you, for instance, bring it into the international institutional context. So you have, like Ariane was mentioning, it has a lot to do with power decisions and decision-making processes invisible to us. And on top of that, it has a lot to do with, let's say, cultural norms and practices, if you like, which you usually find through all the different institutions. And they're usually invisible for people outside of these individual institutions. So I think these are the critical columns to break, to open.
Wonderful. So that kind of bridges really neatly, I think, also to something that's been launched in the last couple of days more publicly, as I think Johannes mentioned, this IPBES multiple values assessment. Talking of norms, I mean, I think we're seeing a shift in the kind of normatives of how we think about values, valuation, all these processes. So I want to kind of be a bit more specific. How can we think about, and drawing on Ian's presentation and some of the others, how can we think about the indicators when we have to start to grapple these multiple values? How can we start to get a more inclusive definition of indicators? And sometimes might they contrast, might they oppose one another? Any thoughts on that, just briefly, and then we'll move towards the wrap up. So please just go ahead, turn on your mic and give a quick answer. Anyone?
I thought Johannes was reaching for his mic, sorry. To indeed acknowledge this plural values as IPBES and others have been argued for, I think we do need to recognize that we need different indicators for this. Some of these indicators would relate really to more biodiversity or aesthetics. Other indicators are much more socioeconomically related, and I think these plural values, they are within the values of nature, but they are also, I think, in a wider context. It's not only about the direct benefits of nature, but also the more indirect and more socially oriented benefits, ranging from the social cohesion to the contribution to economic issues. So I think this plural valuation, it needs to be really plural, but really also beyond the direct benefits of nature.
And coming back to this sort of central theme in community planning and urban theory, what about spaces for discourse, disagreement, airing of conflicts? And Johannes, I know this is probably close to you, but also maybe Erica. Do you see MBS as a kind of arena for opening up and verbalizing these kind of helpful disagreement, you know, in a constructive way, perhaps in a more friendly way?
If we frame it broad enough. So that links to the beginning of my framework, of my talk, that I think we need to have this really inclusive framing, and I think you can frame nature-based solutions in a narrow way and only focusing, for example, on ecological aspects, or you can frame it in a wider way in being inclusive to the social aspects and the technical aspects, and opening debate then there. So I think it might help if we use it in this very inclusive way to become an arena where then things can be broadly debated.
Sure, super. Any final thoughts on that?
Maybe, Tom, if I may, just to add to what Johannes just said, I also think it's the issue is not maybe on a conceptual level, but usually what we face with all the different methods is simply the question how to reach the unreachable, how those are usually really invisible. And we can have a very proper, sophisticated set of indicators, but if you cannot get those people on board, then it's the whole process you planned, it's kind of, well, at least not covering the majority. Including
presumably young people. And Erica, I think you maybe had a conflict also for the microphone there for a moment, but any final thoughts before?
Sí, como para concluir, yo creo que
yes, just to conclude, I think that nature-based solutions applied at the maximum level could give us a space to democratize public space.
Realmente sean democráticos para todos y para
And
todas.
when they truly become democratic for everybody and accessible and safe, they would provide benefits for the entire population, and then we can start to close these gaps, and also we can start to generate spaces that currently don't exist, much like the cases that I presented, where it will be opportune for people to get to know each other, for there to be more of an interaction, and so that eventually they can have social action. At CBIMA, we think that this will generate awareness at a collective level. So our aspiration for these nature-based solutions should be to achieve that collective awareness, and we should aspire to make sure that our cities are a lot more resilient as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. It's been a really fascinating, interesting.
Maravilloso. Mil gracias a todos. Fue una sesión fascinante y estimulante.
Briefly to tell people about what's happening tomorrow, and then just do a few closing comments. But thank you on behalf of all of us for your wonderful talks. Much appreciated. So,
it's a pleasure.
So hopefully you will see my presentation any moment now. I think you're probably seeing the whole screen, right?
Not in presentation mode, but
okay, now it's okay.
Yeah, it's fine.
Wonderful. So yeah, EU Regions Week, and I think some very relevant themes to finish off, and particularly given the social cohesion focus of this year's event and discussions. And I think that, you know, I mentioned before this kind of launch of the Urban Greening Plans initiative. So we heard from Ben at the very beginning about the Urban Greening Plans, which I think together with the urban restoration law proposals be a really strong impulse. Although not mandatory, will still no doubt give us a significant kind of driver for uptake of nature-based solutions. And I know there's been some doubts expressed about the lack of urgency on some of the urban targets, but looking at the alternatives of maybe a market-driven approach, such as biodiversity net gain linked with developments, I think you can see the possibility for citywide more transformational processes. And that also, I think, from the European perspective, really re-emphasizes the benefit of international cooperation, guidance, but also regulatory and logistical, but also in terms of sharing knowledge, as exemplified by Lily's presentation in terms of UNEP's work and a forthcoming book on nature-based solutions in Latin America and the Caribbean. And talking of the kind of over-reliance in a way on the private sector, we heard from David Barton and others about not overplaying the hand of business models and nature-based economy, perhaps shifting in Daniela's presentation towards nature-based, nature-positive economy in some respects. The two things I think are very strongly linked. And I was kind of reflecting on some work published this year by Dieppe et al. In Sao Paulo, actually, around it won't work here. Now, this kind of the interjections by David and also Marianne later kind of reinforce this issue of the importance of recognizing that not all places are the same. And sometimes we need to start thinking a bit more carefully about aligning the vectors of public investment, which will always be a valid contribution, together with that private investment that people talk about so much, blended finance, but I think we see very rare instances. And that draws me to McKenna's intervention in the subsequent session in governance. The Urban Atlas provides very wonderful practical tools, instruments and lessons, and it's fascinating diversity of different instruments in relation to good practices and economic and fiscal categories. Fascinating to hear again the kind of dominance of legal, regulatory and strategic tools and models that seem to predominate there still. Then we heard from Stefan Pauli, reporting on work with Martina van Leerop and Andrea Schieber as well from CONEXUS, on that kind of ecosystem of guidance. So a two-way learning process about the existing materials available and how they can be improved upon by working together more effectively. That took us through to Diana Wiesner's presentation on the kind of laboratory, she called it, of territorial transformation in the fascinating and familiar city to me of Bogotá in Colombia. And three wonderfully incisive, powerful words of passion, perseverance and persistence. I mean, I think it says so much about nature-based solutions on the ground in places where maybe there's not so much privilege and so on. Then we heard from Efren around the importance of standards and standardization, but with an emphasis on quality of nature-based solutions. And this provides an interesting mix of those kind of local qualities, the individual context in terms of communities, but also critically the local ecologies. I think we have to acknowledge that biodiversity is local in its nature, as well as being within a nested network of cities and regions and countries. But there is this kind of problematic of modularity, I would class it. The issue that when you try to upscale the processes, we have to recognize that NBS, nature-based solutions, are not like Fords. They're not like Ford cars. They come in different colors, and you can't produce them on an assembly line because local ecosystems differ from one another. And I think that message is starting to come through. So we had the critical issues of kind of long-term commitment, and again, stressed today in the urban greening plan, the political commitment. And I think that starts to also interrelate with some of the governance themes, the three elements of ecosystem services justice in Johannes's talk, and then picked up in nature-based thinking, but also participatory monitoring processes in Ian's overview. Really giving a kind of some more practical guidance, and then through to Erica's wonderful intervention about some of the methods applied in deprived dense urban districts, the real benefits to people of adapting to change, but also that direct interface with people who have very little. And we have to acknowledge and grapple with those specific challenges using the best evidence we can. And then finally, fascinating interplay there between the kind of social, perceived and biological networks in Manuel's talk, and the kind of the possibilities for engagement in those multiple realms of the socio-ecological domains. So that really brings me to the end of the kind of summing up, and it gives me a chance to say thank you to the full projects. Here are the websites of CONEXUS, REGREEN, INTERLACE and Clearing House. You can find out much more about the projects. Tomorrow we start at 9 o'clock Europe time, which is 8 o'clock here in the UK, and we'll hear from Rick and then following on from on the education aspects, the environmental aspects and the ecological aspects of nature-based solutions. So please, if you can, do join us. We've got a massive diversity of experiences and possibilities to draw from between these 4 projects. So, you know, I really do commend the projects to you. And finally, I would like to thank all of you as participants for really engaging discussion. Thank you for using the chat and Q&A functions, and the unsung heroes. So Rosa, in terms of helping to get things organized, and the interpreters, the translators, for doing a genuinely wonderful job. And I'm sure it's not the easiest circumstances when people like me maybe speak a bit too quickly sometimes. So I think that brings us to the end. I should stop sharing, if I can stop sharing, and we will see each other hopefully again tomorrow morning early on. I believe that there is a kind of possibility for evaluation and feedback in the chat. I think it's probably time for me to sign off and give you your evening back, and really look forward to further discussions on nature-based solutions in Europe, China and Latin America tomorrow. Many thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you, translators. Thank you, Marianne, Sandra, and McKenna.
Thank you all too.